Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The scratching started 3 weeks after I moved in. I'd just gotten back from another graveyard shift, my eyes burning from 12 hours of server maintenance at the data center. The old building's elevator wheezed its way up to the 7th floor, the top floor, and I stumbled down the dimly lit hallway to my studio apartment. That's when I heard it. A soft, deliberate scraping directly above my door, like fingernails dragging across wood. I stood there, key hovering near the lock, listening. The sound stopped the moment my key clicked into place. Milwaukee winters are brutal, and this one was no exception. The radiator in my studio clanged and hissed like it was fighting for its life, but at least the rent was cheap. The building itself was a relic from the 1920s, all Art Deco facades and creaking bones. My studio was essentially the entire top floor's corner unit, a luxury of space offset by decades of deferred maintenance. Above me was nothing but the attic, accessed through a hatch in my ceiling that the landlord assured me was sealed and hadn't been opened in years. The first few nights I convinced myself the scratching was just the building settling, or maybe pigeons nesting in the rafters. Old buildings make noise. But then my doorbell camera started acting up. I'd installed it myself, a top-of-the-line model with night vision and cloud storage. Every morning when I reviewed the footage from while I was at work, I'd see shadows passing across the lens. Not distinct shapes, just darkness moving where there should be nothing. The timestamps were always between 3 and 4 a.m. But when I'd try to download the clips for closer inspection, the files would corrupt. Every single time. I mentioned it to the building superintendent during one of his rare appearances. He just shrugged and muttered something about electrical interference from the old wiring. But I knew better. I work with data corruption for a living. This wasn't random degradation. The files were being deliberately scrambled. The scratching evolved into a routine. Every night when I returned from my shift around 6 a.m., I'd hear it stop just as I reached my door. During the day while I tried to sleep, nothing. But I started noticing other things. The attic hatch, a painted-over square panel in my bedroom ceiling, had developed a thin line of dust around its edges. Fresh dust, not the caked-on grime of decades. I set up my laptop to record the hatch while I was at work. The next morning, reviewing the footage with bloodshot eyes and my third cup of coffee, I saw it. At 3:47 a.m. the panel shifted, just a few inches, sliding to one side. A cascade of dust and insulation particles drifted down onto my unmade bed. The panel remained open for exactly 13 minutes before sliding back into place. My hands shook as I rewound and watched again. The panel moved with deliberate precision, not like it was being pushed by air pressure or the building settling. Someone, or something, was controlling it. That evening, before leaving for work, I stood on a chair and examined the hatch. The paint seal was definitely broken, hairline cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. I pressed up against it gently. It gave slightly, then stuck. There was no lock, no visible mechanism to keep it closed. Just paint and decades of dust. I should have called the police then. Should have demanded the landlord investigate. But what would I say? That my ceiling moved while I was gone? That shadows corrupted my security footage? They'd think I was having a breakdown from too many night shifts. So I did what any paranoid IT professional would do. I set traps. Tiny pieces of tape across the hatch edges that would break if it opened. Flour dusted on the floor beneath it. A motion-activated camera pointed directly at the ceiling, saved to a local drive instead of the cloud. The next morning, the tape was broken. The flour showed no footprints, just a circular disturbance like something had been lowered and raised without touching the ground. And the camera? The SD card was missing entirely. That's when I started finding things. The first was the lighter. Chrome Zippo with the initials RK engraved on the side, found sitting on my kitchen counter one morning. I don't smoke. Never have. The lighter was old but well maintained. the mechanism smooth when I nervously flicked it open and closed. Then came the food. I'd wake up to find sandwiches wrapped in wax paper on my desk. Not moldy or rotten, fresh sandwiches with meat I didn't recognize and bread that tasted homemade. Once, I found a thermos of soup still warm, smelling of herbs I couldn't identify. The rational part of my brain screamed that I shouldn't eat any of it, but after a particularly brutal shift, hunger won. The soup was the best I'd ever tasted, rich and complex with a slightly metallic aftertaste that lingered for hours. But the phone charger was what really unraveled me. I discovered it one afternoon when I couldn't sleep, the anxiety keeping me wired despite my exhaustion. Following the cord from where it was plugged into an outlet behind my bookshelf, an outlet I'd never noticed before. I traced it up the wall, along the ceiling molding, and through a tiny hole drilled right next to the attic hatch. The charger itself dangled into the darkness above. I stood on my bed, reached up, and pulled. The charger came free easily, along with about 3 feet of extension cord that had been hidden in the attic space. The plug was warm, like it had just been in use. That night, I didn't go to work. I called in sick and waited in my apartment with every light on, watching the ceiling. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps above me. Not the scratching or settling sounds I'd grown accustomed to, but clear, deliberate footsteps. They moved from one end of the attic to the other, paused directly above the hatch, then continued in a pattern I couldn't decipher. I grabbed my laptop and started researching the building's history. What I found made my skin crawl. In 1987, a man had lived in this exact unit. The newspaper archives were sparse on details, but he'd been found after neighbors complained about a smell. He'd been dead for months, they said. But here's the thing that made no sense. The apartment had been locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry, no suicide note. The cause of death was listed as undetermined. The man's name was listed in the obituary. His initials were R.K. I dug deeper. The building's records showed a peculiarity. Officially, there was no attic access from any of the 7th floor units. The only way into the attic was supposed to be through a locked door in the maintenance area of the basement, which led to a narrow service stairway. But that door had been welded shut in 1992 after a series of break-ins. So how was someone getting into my ceiling? The next day, exhausted and borderline delirious, I did something desperate. I left a note on my kitchen counter. Who are you? When I woke up that evening, there was a response written in spidery handwriting. The one who was here first. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed the note and noticed something else. Wet footprints on my floor, leading from the area under the hatch to the kitchen and back. But the prints weren't quite right. They were too narrow, too long, with what looked like an extra joint in the middle of the foot. I started sleeping at the data center, curled up in the server room where the white noise of fans drowned out my racing thoughts. But I had to go back to the apartment eventually. All my things were there, and I couldn't afford to break the lease. When I finally returned 3 days later, the apartment was different. Nothing dramatic, just subtle wrongness. My furniture had been moved, only by inches, but enough that I kept bumping into things. The food in my refrigerator had been reorganized. My bathroom mirror had been cleaned, but only in a perfect circle at a height about 8 inches above my eye level. And there were more notes scattered throughout the apartment like breadcrumbs. You work too much. The soup helps you sleep. The old wiring sings at night. Each one in that same spidery script, each one making less sense than the last. I set up one final test. I bought a carbon monoxide detector, thinking maybe I was being slowly poisoned by a leak, hallucinating everything, but the levels were normal. I bought an EMF detector, wondering if electromagnetic fields were affecting my brain. Nothing unusual. I even had my blood tested for drugs. Clean. One night, I pretended to leave for work, but doubled back, hiding in the stairwell with a clear view of my door. I waited 4 hours, fighting off sleep, watching. Nothing happened. But when I finally gave up and entered my apartment, there was fresh food on my counter and wet footprints on the ceiling. The ceiling. The footprints were on the ceiling. That's when I understood. The thing living above me, it didn't follow the same rules. It didn't need doors or stairs. The attic hatch wasn't its entrance. It was its window into my world. It had been there all along, maybe since before the building was even built, existing in the spaces between spaces. I write this now from my apartment, where I've decided to stay. The scratching has become almost comforting, a reminder that I'm not alone. The food it leaves is getting better, more elaborate. Last night there was a full roasted chicken that tasted like it had been marinated in memories. The notes have evolved too. They tell stories now, fragments of lives lived in this space over decades. RK was just one of many. They've all shared this apartment with the thing above, some knowingly, some not. Some fought it, some fed it, some simply coexisted. I found one final piece of evidence yesterday, hidden behind a loose baseboard. It's a photograph from 1924, the year the building was completed. It shows the construction crew standing in front of the unfinished 7th floor. But there, in the skeletal framework where the attic would be, there's a shadow that doesn't match anything else in the photo. A shadow with too many angles, perched like it's waiting. The superintendent called me today, said the apartment below mine is available if I want to move. The current tenant is leaving suddenly. Something about noises from above, scratching in the ceiling. I told him I was happy where I was. Tonight, when I get home from my shift, I know the scratching will stop just as I reach my door. But now I understand it's not stopping because I've arrived. It's stopping to listen, to make sure I've come home safely. The hatch hasn't opened in 3 days, but I can feel it up there, waiting. Not malevolent, just present. Existing alongside me in this space we share, this boundary between what's real and what's possible. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I stand on my bed and press my palm against the hatch. It's warm, always warm, pulsing with something that might be a heartbeat, or might be the building's ancient circulation. I've started leaving my own notes on the counter. Simple things. Thank you for the soup. The chicken was perfect. I fixed the wireless router. This morning I found a response that made me laugh, a sound I hadn't made in weeks. The Wi-Fi password is in the walls. I'm not crazy. I've checked and rechecked every possible explanation. The thing above me is real as anything can be in the spaces where reality gets thin. It's been here longer than the building, longer than the city maybe, and now it's chosen me, or perhaps I've chosen it, to share this strange existence. The scratching is starting again. It's almost 6 a.m., time for me to head home. But I've been thinking, if it can walk on my ceiling, if it can exist in spaces that shouldn't be there, then maybe the apartment isn't what I thought it was. Maybe I'm not living on the top floor at all. Maybe I'm living in the space between floors, in a pocket of reality that only exists when observed. Or maybe, and this thought comes to me only in the drowsy moments before sleep, maybe I'm the one living in the attic. Maybe I'm the thing that scratches. Maybe the notes I find are the ones I've written to myself, and the footprints on the ceiling are mine from when I walk in the real apartment above. The one where RK still lives, still leaves his lighter on the counter, still makes soup that tastes like memories. The hatch is opening now. I can feel it even from here at work, miles away. Something is coming through, or maybe something is going home. I should be terrified, but all I feel is a strange anticipation, like when you're about to remember something important you'd forgotten. Tonight, when I get back, I think I'll leave the lights off. I think I'll finally see what's been sharing my ceiling. The scratching isn't stopping anymore when I reach my door. Now it's matching my heartbeat, synchronized to my breathing. We're learning each other's rhythms, the tenant above and I. Or maybe we always knew them. Maybe we've always been the same. Story 2. The notebook arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in brown paper that smelled of mothballs and decay. I found it propped against my apartment door. No postmark, no return address. Just my name written in spidery handwriting that seemed to crawl across the package. Inside, tucked between pages of meticulous sketches, was a note on yellowed paper. Don't descend the steps. I'd been running my urban exploration blog for 3 years, documenting forgotten places where nature reclaimed human ambition. The retired professor who sent this, a man I'd met only once at a historical society lecture, had vanished into what his colleagues called a necessary retreat for his health. But his sketches spoke of obsession, page after page depicting a stone cistern hidden somewhere in the Appalachian wilderness, each drawing more detailed than the last, showing angles impossible to capture from a single vantage point. The sketches pulled at something deep in my chest, a sensation like hooks beneath my ribs. Each page revealed new details. The weathered limestone blocks fitted without mortar, the iron ring set into the capstone, the peculiar symbols carved around the rim that resembled no language I recognized. The professor's notes, scrawled in margins, mentioned coordinates that led to a trailhead 40 miles from any town worth naming. I should have left it alone, should have filed it away with the other tips that led nowhere. But that night, as I uploaded photos from an abandoned textile mill to my blog, I found myself tracing the cistern's outline with my finger, feeling the paper's texture as if it might reveal secrets through touch alone. The drive took 6 hours through progressively narrowing roads, until asphalt gave way to gravel, then dirt, then barely a suggestion of a path between trees. My GPS lost signal 2 hours from the coordinates. The October air bit through my jacket as I shouldered my pack, checking my camera equipment one final time before heading into the woods. The trail markers matched the professor's sketches perfectly, too perfectly. Every bent tree, every distinctive rock formation appeared exactly as drawn, as if the forest had frozen in place since his visit. The path wound upward through stands of oak and maple, their leaves the color of dried blood in the afternoon light. 3 miles in, I found the first arrow. It was carved deep into an ancient oak pointing back the way I'd come. Fresh sap wept from the wounds in the bark. The cuts couldn't have been more than a day old. A few yards further, another arrow on a different tree also pointing backward. Then another, and another, an entire chorus of trees screaming silently for me to turn around. The temperature dropped as shadows lengthened. My breath came out in clouds despite the season. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of my boots crushing leaves that seemed too loud, too sharp, as if the woods were amplifying every step to announce my presence. I found the cistern, just as the sketches promised, in a clearing where the trees pulled back as if repulsed. The stone structure rose from the earth like a tumor, its limestone blocks green with moss except for the top, which gleamed white as exposed bone. Heavy chains, thick as my wrist and red with rust, wrapped around the entire circumference of the capstone. Padlocks the size of my fist secured every few feet of chain. The clearing felt wrong. The air tasted metallic, and a pressure built behind my eyes the longer I looked at the cistern. My camera felt heavier in my hands as I raised it, the autofocus hunting frantically before giving up. Every photo came out wrong. Overexposed, underexposed, or simply showing nothing but darkness despite the fading daylight. I circled the structure, noting details the professor's sketches had missed or deliberately omitted. Scratches in the stone that might have been words in a language that predated writing. Stains that looked organic, as if something had seeped up from below rather than spilled from above. The chains weren't just wrapped. They were woven in a pattern that hurt to follow with my eyes, a complexity that suggested purpose beyond simple security. The sun touched the horizon. In the dying light, I saw them, footprints in the dirt around the cistern, dozens of them, all facing inward. All stopped exactly 3 feet from the stone, as if an invisible barrier held them back. Some looked fresh. Others had been there long enough for moss to grow in the depressions. My phone, useless for navigation, still showed the time. 6:47 p.m. Darkness would come fast in these mountains. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe through countless explorations, screamed at me to leave. But something else, something that felt like fingers wrapped around my spine, held me in place. I knelt beside the cistern, running my hand along the chains. They were warm despite the cold air, pulsing with a rhythm that might have been my imagination, or might have been something far worse. The padlocks had no keyholes, just smooth metal surfaces that reflected my face in distorted fragments. That's when I heard it, a sound from below the stone. Not quite breathing, not quite whispering, but something between the two. A wet, organic sound that made my teeth ache. The chains creaked, tension running through them like a shiver. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on something soft. A notebook, identical to the one the professor had sent, lay half buried in the leaves. Inside, my own handwriting filled the pages, sketches of the cistern from angles I hadn't drawn yet, notes about details I hadn't noticed, and at the bottom of the last page, a single line. He's almost ready to come up. The walk back to my car happened in fragments. One moment I was at the cistern, the next I was running through trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches catching at my clothes. The arrows carved into the bark glowed faintly in the darkness, no longer pointing away but forming a spiral pattern that made my vision blur. My car was where I'd left it, covered in leaves as if it had been there for weeks instead of hours. The engine turned over on the third try, headlights cutting through fog that hadn't been there before. As I drove, too fast for the narrow road, my phone buzzed with notifications. Comments on my blog, dozens of them, all anonymous, all containing excerpts from the professor's notebook. Pages I'd never photographed, never shared. They described things beneath the cistern, things that had been placed there by people who understood what darkness meant before humans invented fire, things that whispered promises to anyone who would listen. The final comment contained a photo, me standing at the cistern, my hand on the chains. But in the image, I was smiling, and the chains were gone, and something pale and wet was climbing out behind me. I drove through the night, stopping only when the gas gauge forced me to. At a 24-hour station, fluorescent lights harsh enough to hurt, I checked my camera. Every photo I'd taken was there, but wrong. Each image showed the cistern open, its depths black as the space between stars. And in the final frames, something climbing up, using holds carved into the stone walls, its shape suggesting anatomy that shouldn't exist. Back in my apartment, I tried to delete the blog post about the textile mill, to remove any connection to that day, but the comments kept coming. URLs I didn't recognize linked to other blogs, other explorers who'd found similar structures. All sealed, all waiting. The professor's notebook sits on my desk as I write this. I've been through it a dozen times now, finding new pages that weren't there before, or maybe I just didn't see them. Maps to other sites, instructions written in multiple hands across decades, maybe centuries, and always, always, that same warning. Don't descend the steps. But here's what haunts me, what keeps me awake as dawn approaches and shadows move in my peripheral vision. I never saw any steps. The cistern was sealed, chained, locked, no way down visible. So why do I remember descending? Why can I feel stone steps beneath my feet, worn smooth by countless passages, leading down into darkness that tastes of copper and old earth? My phone buzzes. Another comment, this one different from the rest. It's from the professor's account. Impossible since his colleague told me he'd been hospitalized 3 states away. Catatonic, unresponsive. The message is simple. Check your pocket. In my jacket pocket, the one I'm certain was empty, I find a key. Ancient iron, heavy, its head shaped like those symbols around the cistern's rim. It's warm to the touch, pulsing with that same rhythm I felt in the chains. I know I should throw it away, burn the notebook, delete the blog, move to another city, another state, somewhere far from mountains and forests and things that wait beneath stone. But my fingers trace the key's outline, and I can feel the cistern calling, a vibration in my bones that grows stronger with each passing hour. Tomorrow, I tell myself, I'll decide what to do tomorrow. But as I look at my computer screen, at the blog post I don't remember writing, I see I've already uploaded the coordinates. The comments section fills with responses, people planning trips, expeditions, investigations, all of them ignoring the warnings, just as I did. The sun rises, but the shadows in my apartment grow longer. In their depths, I catch glimpses of stone steps leading down, always down, into a darkness that watches and waits and whispers promises I'm beginning to understand. The key grows heavier in my hand, and I realize with a clarity that feels like drowning, I've already descended those steps. We all have. We just haven't remembered it yet. The cistern was never locked to keep us out. It was locked to keep us in. And now, with every blog post, every comment, every shared coordinate, we're spreading like spores from something ancient and patient, carrying keys we don't remember receiving, returning to places we've never left, descending steps that exist in spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. My hands move across the keyboard without my volition, typing coordinates to other sites, other cisterns, other sealed places that pulse with that familiar rhythm. The blog posts multiply, spreading across the internet like veins, like roots, like the branches of those trees, all pointing in directions that make no sense unless you've been down the steps, unless you've seen what waits, unless you've understood that the professor's warning wasn't about prevention. It was about acceptance. Don't descend the steps, he wrote. But he never said we had a choice. Story 3. The first thing you notice about working nights is how buildings breathe differently when they're empty. The Millbrook Community Center exhales through its vents at 11:47 every night, a long mechanical sigh that runs through the ductwork like something settling into sleep. I've been mopping these floors for 3 months now, long enough to know the building's rhythms, the tick of cooling pipes, the hum of fluorescent ballasts, the way the east wing door catches and whistles when the pressure changes. What I didn't know until last Tuesday was that behind the Little Sprouts daycare playground, hidden by a row of overgrown forsythia bushes, someone had installed a new iron gate. I found it while trimming back the hedges that border the playground. The maintenance supervisor had complained about parents saying the bushes looked unprofessional, so there I was at 2 a.m. with hedge clippers, working by the security light's amber glow. When I pushed through a particularly dense section, my clippers hit metal. Black iron, fresh paint still tacky in spots, formed an ornate gate about 4 feet high. Beyond it, arranged in a rough semicircle, stood 6 headstones. The limestone markers were soft with age, their faces furred with lichen that glowed pale green in the security light. I could make out dates: 1743, 1751, 1748, but the names had worn to suggestions. The ground around them was undisturbed, covered in the same crabgrass and clover as the rest of the field. No cemetery fence, no historical marker, just these 6 stones enclosed by a gate that hadn't been there the week before. I checked the work orders on my phone. Nothing about a gate installation, nothing about historical preservation. The most recent maintenance request for this area was my hedge trimming assignment. The rational part of my brain, the part that had worked warehouse jobs and cleaned office buildings for 15 years, told me there was an explanation. Some historical society project. A memorial garden the daycare was planning, but standing there in the amber light, feeling the new paint stick to my fingers, I couldn't shake the feeling that the gate wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep something in. I went back to my cart, left the hedges half trimmed, and decided to ask about it in the morning. But when morning came, when the daycare director arrived at 6:30 with her coffee and her cheerful exhaustion, I found myself saying nothing. The words stuck in my throat like I was trying to speak underwater. I just nodded when she thanked me for starting on the hedges, promised I'd finish them tonight. That's when I noticed the phone number on the daycare door. 440-555-0666. The area code was right for northeastern Ohio, but I'd never seen a legitimate business number end in 66. When I mentioned it to the director, casually, like I was making conversation, she laughed. I know, right? We've been trying to get it changed for years, but the phone company says it would mess up their whole exchange system. Parents sometimes comment, but... She shrugged, already distracted by a text on her phone. I finished my shift and drove home as the morning school buses started their routes. My apartment, a 1-bedroom above a pizza shop, was dark and stuffy. I lay in bed thinking about those headstones, about the way the lichen had seemed to pulse in the security light. By the time I fell asleep, the sun was high and hot, and I dreamed of iron gates opening and closing like mouths. When I returned that night, the building felt different. Not wrong exactly, but expectant. Like a theater just before curtain rise. I started my routine, checking doors, emptying trash, setting up my cleaning cart. But I kept finding myself drawn to the windows that faced the playground. The gate was still there, a dark shape against the darker field. The security light had burned out. At 11:47, the building exhaled as usual. But this time, there was something else. A phone ringing. The sound came from the daycare wing, a classic bell tone that echoed off the walls. I followed it to the front desk, where an old beige phone, the kind with an actual bell inside, sat silent. The ringing continued, seeming to come from the walls themselves. The caller ID display showed internal 0666. I picked up the receiver. Static, but not random. It had a rhythm, a pattern like breathing or like something trying to form words. I hung up. The ringing started again immediately. This time I ignored it, pushed my cart toward the main hallway. The ringing followed me, jumping from phone to phone as I passed each room. The community center had been renovated 2 years ago, all the phones replaced with a modern VoIP system. But tonight, in every room, I could see the ghost outlines of old phones, like after images burned into the walls where they used to hang. The ringing stopped at exactly midnight. I spent the rest of my shift in the lobby, mopping the same section of floor over and over, avoiding the daycare wing entirely. When morning came, when the early staff started arriving, everything looked normal. The director smiled at me, mentioned how nice the floors looked. I smiled back, my face feeling like a mask that might crack if I moved too suddenly. The next night, I arrived to find the water fountain in the children's corridor running. Not broken, not stuck, running in a steady, controlled stream. I turned it off. 5 minutes later, it was running again. The water was ice cold and tasted of minerals, of deep earth, though the building used city water. I turned it off again. This time I watched. At exactly 12:17, the handle depressed by itself. A slow, deliberate movement, like an invisible hand pressing down. The water ran for 30 seconds, then stopped. That's when the motion sensors started. The children's corridor has sensors every 20 feet, little white boxes that turn on path lighting for nighttime bathroom trips during sleepovers or evening events. They started lighting up in sequence, one after another, tracking movement from the fountain toward the side door, the door that faced the playground, the door nearest the gate. I followed the lights, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Each sensor triggered just ahead of me, as if something was walking the same path, always a few steps in the lead. At the side door, I pressed my face to the window. The gate stood open. I knew with the kind of certainty that bypasses thought, that it had been closed when I arrived. The gap was narrow, maybe 2 feet, but in the darkness beyond I could see something pale. Not moving, not exactly, but shifting, like lichen growing in time-lapse, like text being written by an invisible hand. The phone started ringing again, every phone in the building, a cascade of bells that seemed to shake the walls. I ran back to the daycare desk, grabbed the receiver. This time, the static formed words. Not spoken, but assembled from the white noise, like someone tuning through radio frequencies to build sentences. The congregation waits. I slammed the phone down so hard the plastic cracked. The ringing stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It had weight, presence, like something massive holding its breath. I abandoned my cart, my supplies, everything. Grabbed my keys and headed for the exit, but my legs wouldn't carry me there. Instead, they walked me back to the children's corridor, to the side door, to the window that faced the playground. The gate was closed now, but arranged in front of it, laid out in a perfect line on the grass, were 6 small objects. I had to press my face against the glass, cup my hands around my eyes to block the reflection, to make them out in the darkness. 6 old telephone receivers, the kind from rotary phones, their cords severed and arranged like roses on a grave. I don't remember the rest of that shift. I came to myself at dawn, sitting in my car in the parking lot, watching the daycare teachers arrive. My hands were dirty, soil under my fingernails, though I had no memory of being outside. The director knocked on my window, asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was coming down with something, might need a few nights off. But I came back. Of course I came back. The building expected me. Each night now, the routine intensifies. The phone calls come in patterns. 3 rings, pause, 3 rings, pause, like a ceremony being performed. The water fountain runs at 12:17, 2:17, and 4:17, each time for exactly 30 seconds. The motion sensors trace different paths now, sometimes spiraling through the hallways, sometimes gathering in clusters like invisible crowds forming and dispersing. I've started finding things. Old daycare attendance sheets from the 1950s, though the building wasn't constructed until 1987. A child's drawing of 6 tall figures standing in a circle, though no children have been here after hours. A maintenance log from 1743, the same date as one of the headstones, describing repairs to a meeting house that stood on this ground. The log entry that stopped me cold was dated October 31st. The congregation persists in their observances, despite the trustees' objections. They claim the little ones must be taught the old ways, that the ground remembers what we would forget. Have ordered the doors barred, come November, though I fear it may be too late. The bells will not cease their calling. Last night, I found the source of the calling. It wasn't the phones. It never had been. In the daycare storage room, behind boxes of art supplies and nap mats, I discovered a panel in the wall. Not hidden exactly, but unnoticed. Behind it, a tangle of old wires led down into the foundation. I followed them with my flashlight beam, down through a gap that shouldn't exist, into a space that wasn't on any blueprint. The bells were there, 6 of them, tarnished brass, each the size of a child's head. They were mounted on a mechanism that looked like a music box made of iron and bone, actual bone, yellowed and smooth. The mechanism was turning, had been turning, perhaps had never stopped turning since 1743. Each bell rang in sequence, but the sound was being translated, transformed through the building's phone system into something almost like words. Behind the bells, carved into the foundation stone, were names, 6 names, matching the graves outside, and below them, dozens more. Hundreds. Names and dates stretching back, and forward too. Dates that haven't happened yet. Names of children who haven't been born. I found my own name there. Dated tomorrow. I should leave. I should quit. Move. Forget this place exists. But every morning when my shift ends, when the sun rises and the daycare fills with the chaos of living children, the memory fades like a dream. It only comes back when I return at night, when I see the gate, when the building starts its breathing. Tonight, standing in the children's corridor at 3 a.m., I watch the water fountain begin its cycle. The motion sensors light a path I've never seen before, not to the side door, but to a wall that should be solid. As I approach, I can see the outline of a door that was plastered over, painted to match the cheerful yellow of the daycare walls. Through the paint, through the plaster, something presses against the surface from the other side, the shape of small hands. The phone rings. This time I don't need to answer to hear the message. It comes through the walls, through the pipes, through the very air. The congregation gathers. The little ones remember. The ground keeps what was given. I understand now why the gate wasn't meant to keep people out. We're already in. We've always been in. The building isn't haunted. It's a machine. A mechanism designed to do something specific at specific times, and we're just the gears that keep it running. The daycare, with its bright colors and alphabet posters, is camouflage. The real purpose happens after dark, in the mechanical precision of bells and water and light, calling something that was never quite buried, never quite gone. Tomorrow, according to the stone, is my date. But tomorrow never comes for night janitors. There's only the endless loop of darkness and duty, of cleaning and maintaining, of keeping the machine running for purposes we're not meant to understand. The water fountain stops. The lights go dark. In the silence, I hear the gate opening, though I'm nowhere near a window. Metal scraping against metal, a sound like breathing, like something vast and patient drawing closer. I return to my cart, resume my mopping. The fluorescent lights flicker in a pattern that might be code, might be language, might be laughter. At 4:47, the building will inhale instead of exhale, and something will shift. The daycare rooms will rearrange themselves in ways that won't be noticed come morning. The children's drawings on the walls will show different scenes, 6 figures becoming 7, the circle growing wider. My shift ends at 6 a.m. The director will arrive at 6:30. She'll thank me for my work, mention how clean everything looks. I'll nod and smile and go home to my apartment above the pizza shop. I'll sleep through the day and dream of iron gates and limestone markers and the sound of small hands pressing against walls that shouldn't exist. And tomorrow night, because there's always a tomorrow night for those of us who work in the spaces between day and darkness, I'll come back. The building expects me. The congregation waits. The ground remembers. The phone is ringing again. This time, I think I'll answer. After all, it's probably for me. Story 4. The August heat in Phoenix creates mirages that make you question what's real. Shimmering waves rising from asphalt, distant buildings warping like funhouse reflections. I'd been standing outside the Biltmore Fashion Park for 12 minutes, watching my rideshare app recalculate arrival times, when the man with the orthopedic boot first approached me. His limp was pronounced, theatrical even, the medical boot scraping against concrete with each labored step. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mall's exterior misters working overtime. He gestured toward the covered parking structure, explaining he couldn't manage his shopping bags alone. Something in his eyes, too steady, too watchful, made my skin prickle. I declined politely, citing my incoming ride. He laughed then, a sound like grinding metal, before disappearing back into the automatic doors. 3 hours later, I saw him again. The gym at my apartment complex stays open until midnight, a selling point that had seemed important during the divorce proceedings when sleep became impossible. I'd been running on the treadmill, earbuds drowning out the world, when movement in the mirror caught my attention. There he was, same face, same build, but running, sprinting on the machine 2 rows behind me. No boot, no limp, just fluid, perfect motion. Our eyes met in the mirror's reflection. He smiled and increased his speed. I left immediately, but the image burned behind my eyelids. That transformation from wounded to whole, the deliberate revelation of his deception. In the elevator, my music cut out 3 times, always at the same spot, between the 2nd and 3rd floors, right where the service ramp for wheelchair access begins its gentle slope. The messages started that night. Unknown number. No text, just photographs. Me at various points throughout my day, all taken from low angles, the perspective someone in a wheelchair might have. Me at the coffee shop that morning, shot from beneath the outdoor table. Me entering my office building, captured from sidewalk level. Me at the grocery store, framed between the wheels of shopping carts. I blocked the number. New ones appeared. Always the same angle. Always that vulnerable perspective from below, making me look monstrous and strange in my normalcy. My ability to simply walk without thought. The police suggested changing my routine. The building's security found nothing unusual on the cameras. My therapist, still helping me process the divorce, wondered if stress was manifesting in hypervigilance. But stress doesn't explain how my credit card got charged for a medical supply store I'd never visited. The receipt showing a purchase of 1 orthopedic boot, 1 collapsible wheelchair, and something called a gait training system. I started seeing them everywhere. People with mobility aids who moved just slightly wrong. A woman with a cane who forgot which hand to use when she thought no one was looking. A teenager in a wheelchair whose legs tensed with unused strength. An elderly man with a walker who covered ground too quickly, as if the aluminum frame was pulling him forward rather than supporting him. Or maybe I was seeing nothing. Maybe Phoenix's heat was finally getting to me, creating mirages of meaning where none existed. The breaking point came 3 weeks after that first encounter. I'd been working late, the office empty except for security. The elevator descended normally until that familiar spot, the second floor, where it shuddered to a stop. The lights flickered. My phone buzzed with another photo. Me, right then, in that elevator, shot from the corner where someone small or crouched might hide. But I was alone. The elevator was empty. I could see every corner, every inch of that confined space. The photo showed someone behind me. When the doors finally opened, I ran. Down the stairwell, through the lobby, into the parking garage where my car waited. The fluorescent lights hummed their sick green pallor, creating pools of shadow between concrete pillars. My footsteps echoed wrong, too many beats, as if accompanied by something trying to match my rhythm but falling just short. The car wouldn't start. The engine turned over, sputtered, died. In the rearview mirror, I saw him approaching, not limping, not running, but gliding somehow, his body moving without the mechanical articulation of joints and muscles. The orthopedic boot was back, but it didn't touch the ground. He pushed an empty wheelchair that rolled too smoothly, its wheels spinning without friction. He stopped 10 feet away and began to lower himself into the chair with exaggerated difficulty, each movement a pantomime of struggle. His face contorted with manufactured pain, eyes rolling back to show too much white. Then he looked directly at me and spoke, not with his mouth, which remained twisted in its grimace of false suffering, but somehow directly into my thoughts. You could have helped. One simple act, but you chose to look away. The engine roared to life. I drove without thinking, without destination, just movement to escape that presence. But Phoenix is a city built on grids, and every turn led back to familiar streets. The traffic lights turned red in sequence, forcing stops at every intersection where crosswalks dipped into wheelchair-accessible ramps. At each stop, they multiplied, figures in wheelchairs, on crutches, wearing medical boots, all moving with that same unnatural fluidity. They crossed without looking, their mobility aids scraping and squeaking in harmonized discord. Some I recognized, the woman with the cane, now using two. The teenager, his wheelchair upgraded to a power model that moved too fast, too smooth. My phone vibrated constantly. Photos poured in, hundreds of them, all from that low angle, but now showing not just me but my reflection in windows, in puddles, in the gleaming surface of parked cars. In each reflection, I was different, distorted. In some, my legs were bent at impossible angles. In others, they were simply gone, my torso floating above empty space. I made it home somehow. The apartment building's garage gate took forever to open, each second stretching like heated taffy. In the resident directory by the entrance, new names had appeared, all with unit numbers that didn't exist. Floors between floors, apartments tucked into architectural impossibilities. The elevator was waiting, doors open, lights flickering in that familiar pattern. I took the stairs instead, each landing requiring more effort than the last. My legs felt heavy, uncoordinated, as if the simple act of walking was becoming foreign to my body. By the 5th floor, I was gripping the handrail, pulling myself up more than stepping. My apartment door was open. Inside, medical equipment filled the space. Walkers, canes, braces, and devices I couldn't name. All new, all tagged with my name, all from that charge I hadn't made. In the center of it all sat a single orthopedic boot, identical to the one he'd worn, sized perfectly for my foot. A note was tucked inside. The body learns what the mind refuses to understand. I didn't put it on. I wouldn't. But as days passed, walking became harder. Not physically. My legs worked fine. But mentally, each step required conscious thought, deliberate action. The automatic ease of mobility dissolved into mechanical computation. Lift foot, move forward, place down, shift weight, repeat. What had been unconscious became agonizingly aware. The photos kept coming, showing my gait deteriorating, my posture changing. Videos now too, surveillance-style footage of me struggling with curbs, hesitating at stairs, moving with the cautious deliberation of someone newly injured. My reflection in shop windows showed me limping, though I felt no pain. Security footage from my building, sent anonymously to my phone, revealed me crawling up the stairs on all fours, though I remembered walking upright. My therapist referred me to a neurologist. The tests showed nothing wrong. The orthopedist found healthy joints, strong muscles, perfect biomechanics. Yet I could barely cross the examination room without stumbling, my body betraying me in ways that defied medical explanation. The man with the boot appeared one last time in the parking lot of the medical complex. No pretense now. He stood straight, moved freely, the boot carried casually in one hand like a prop no longer needed. He watched me struggle to my car, each step an effort of will against failing coordination. He didn't speak, but I understood anyway. This was never about him. It was about the moment of refusal, the instant calculation where empathy was weighed against inconvenience and found wanting. He hadn't been testing my compassion. He'd been revealing its absence, showing me the void where human connection should exist. Or maybe he was showing me something else entirely, that our bodies are just consensus reality, functioning only as long as we all agree on the rules. That walking is a privilege maintained by collective belief, that the moment we truly see the arbitrariness of our physical assumptions, they begin to dissolve. I'm writing this from my apartment, surrounded by mobility aids I've started using, not from need, but from a growing certainty that they were always meant for me. The boot fits perfectly, as I knew it would. The walker glides smoothly across my floor, leading more than following. The wheelchair waits in the corner, patient and inevitable. Sometimes I check those old photos from that unknown number, studying them for clues. But lately, I notice something disturbing. In the newest ones, there's no photographer visible in any reflection, no shadow indicating another person. The angles are impossible for anyone else to have achieved, which means I've been taking them myself somehow. From down there, from that perspective, I refused to understand until it became my own. The Phoenix heat continues to create its mirages, warping the visible world into fluid uncertainty, or maybe the heat has nothing to do with it. Maybe this is just what happens when you refuse to see someone else's reality. You lose the right to your own. I hear footsteps in the hallway now, but they're wrong. Too many beats. An uneven rhythm that suggests damage or adaptation. When I look through the peephole, I see myself approaching, walking perfectly, confidently, the way I used to move. He's carrying shopping bags that look heavy. He's about to knock and ask for help. I already know what my answer will be. Story 5. The first message arrived at 3:47 a.m., glowing against my bedroom ceiling from the phone I'd forgotten to flip over. Not a notification buzz, just the screen lighting up, staying lit, as if someone on the other end knew I was awake, knew I was watching. The message itself was nothing special, a meditation app reminder I didn't remember setting. But the timing felt deliberate, calculated, like fingers tapping on glass in the dark. That was 3 months ago, before the circle, before her, before him. I should explain how it started, though even now, typing this in the borrowed light of a gas station bathroom, I'm not sure where the beginning really was. Maybe it was the Tuesday I decided to attend that professional networking event in Capitol Hill. Maybe it was earlier, when my last relationship imploded and left me scrolling through self-improvement podcasts at 2 a.m. Or maybe, and this thought makes my skin crawl, maybe it started long before I had any awareness of it, like roots growing beneath pavement, waiting for the perfect crack. The networking event was forgettable, except for one detail. A woman in an emerald blazer who seemed to appear beside me whenever I found myself alone. She had this way of tilting her head when she listened, really listened, that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When she handed me her card, it wasn't for a company, just a name, though I won't write it here, and below it, in smaller text, Strategic Life Architecture. She suggested coffee, then lunch, then, eventually, the circle. The circle met in a converted loft overlooking Pike Place Market, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs, the kind of space that whispered success without shouting it. The first meeting felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. 8 professionals, all in tech or adjacent fields, sitting in actual circle formation on meditation cushions that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. The mentor, that woman in emerald, though she wore burnt orange that night, led us through what she called professional soul mapping. It sounds ridiculous now. It didn't then. There was something in the way she spoke, how her voice seemed to bypass your ears and speak directly to some deeper part of your brain. She talked about barriers, about the invisible walls we build between our authentic selves and our potential. She made eye contact with each of us in turn, holding it just long enough to feel significant, but not quite long enough to feel uncomfortable. That's when she mentioned the partnership program. Each circle member would be paired with a growth partner, someone at a similar life stage who could provide accountability and support. She said mine was already selected, someone who'd expressed specific interest in my journey after reviewing my intake form. I didn't remember filling out an intake form, but when I mentioned this, she smiled and reminded me about the digital questionnaire from the networking event, the one I'd completed after 3 glasses of wine. The introduction happened through a proprietary app. No profile photos, just voice messages at first. His voice was warm, educated, with just enough vocal fry to sound approachable rather than pretentious. He knew things about me, not creepy things, but observations that felt insightful. He mentioned my tendency to unconsciously tap my thumb against my thigh when thinking, something I'd never noticed until he pointed it out. Said he did the same thing. We graduated to video calls within a week. He had one of those faces that seemed designed to inspire trust. Symmetrical features. Good lighting that never changed regardless of time of day. Always the same bookshelf in the background with titles I recognized but positioned so I could never quite read the spines clearly. He asked questions that felt like keys turning in locks I didn't know existed. But he never answered mine. Not directly. When I asked where he lived, he'd laugh and say something about geography being irrelevant in our connected age. When I wondered how he'd joined the circle, he'd pivot to asking about my own journey. The strange thing was, I never felt deflected in the moment. Only afterwards, lying in bed, would I realize I still knew nothing concrete about him. The mentor started suggesting optimizations for my life. Small things at first. A morning routine adjustment here. A dietary modification there. She recommended I decline a work trip to San Francisco, saying the timing would interfere with a crucial breakthrough period. When I mentioned I hadn't told her about the trip, she tilted her head in that familiar way and reminded me that growth partners share relevant updates for synchronized development. He'd been telling her things I'd mentioned in what I thought were private conversations. The unease started as a whisper, like a draft from a window you can't locate. I began noticing patterns. Whenever I made plans with friends outside the circle, something would come up. My growth partner would have a crisis that needed processing. The mentor would schedule an emergency session. My phone would malfunction in specific targeted ways, GPS failing when I tried to meet my college roommate for drinks, calendar app deleting everything except circle meetings. Then came the suggestion of the retreat. The mentor presented it during a Tuesday session, her voice taking on that hypnotic quality that made disagreement feel like swimming upstream. A weekend intensive at a regeneration campus in the Cascades. She had slides, professional corporate sleek slides showing cedar cabins and mountain views, and people in expensive athleisure doing trust falls in meadows. The cost was astronomical, but she mentioned payment plans, scholarships for dedicated members, ways to make it work that seemed to materialize as she spoke. My growth partner was enthusiastic in a way that felt rehearsed. His messages came faster, longer, filled with exclamation points that didn't match his usual measured tone. He'd already committed to going, he said. It would be transformative to experience it together, to finally meet in physical space. That's when he sent the first photo. It was innocent enough, him standing beside a welcome sign, mountains blurred in the background. But something was wrong with the image. The shadows fell in impossible directions. The sign's text seemed to shift if I looked at it too long, and his face, that trustworthy face I'd seen in dozens of video calls, looked different in still capture. Older, hungrier, like someone wearing a mask of their younger self. More photos followed. The dormitories, long hallways with identical doors, fluorescent lighting that made everything look medical. The meditation hall, circular, windowless, with cushions arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The dining facility, industrial kitchens glimpsed through serving windows, steam obscuring whatever was being prepared. But it was the photo of other participants that made my chest tighten. A group selfie, 7 or 8 people arranged in front of a cabin. They were all smiling, but their eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated despite bright daylight. And in the background, barely visible through a window, was another face, then another, then another. The cabins were full of watchers. I told the mentor I needed to postpone. Family emergency, I lied. Her response was immediate. Not through the app, not through email, but standing outside my apartment building when I got home from work. She didn't acknowledge the impossibility of her being there, didn't explain how she knew where I lived. She simply stood by the entry door, holding it open, that tilted head listening pose activated like a switch. She said she understood my hesitation. Change was frightening. Growth required discomfort. But the circle had invested so much in my development. The growth partner had already traveled to the campus specifically to support my journey. It would be cruel to abandon him now. I asked how she knew I'd been dishonest about the family emergency. She smiled and said honesty was the foundation of transformation. The pressure intensified over the following days. Circle members I barely knew began reaching out. Their messages, all variations on a theme. How the retreat had changed their lives. How resistance was just fear manifesting. How disappointed they'd be if I broke the circle of trust. My growth partner's messages became erratic. Long voice notes recorded at odd hours. His words slurring not like intoxication but like someone fighting to stay awake. Or fighting to wake up. He described the campus in detail that didn't match his photos. Walls that breathed. Floors that remembered footsteps. A meditation hall that was somehow larger inside than outside. He said they were preparing my room. He'd seen them carrying in boxes with my name on them. Boxes I'd never packed. I stopped responding. Changed my phone number. Moved to a friend's couch. But the messages found ways through. Emails from addresses that shouldn't exist. Voicemails on phones I hadn't given the number to. Handwritten notes under windshield wipers, in coat pockets, between pages of books I was reading. All saying variations of the same thing. The circle is incomplete without you. Last week I saw him. Not my growth partner. I still don't know what he really looks like, but another circle member. Someone who'd stopped attending months ago. He was sitting in a coffee shop in Fremont, laptop open, typing steadily. I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight, enough that his clothes hung loose, and his skin had a grayish tint, like someone who hadn't seen natural light in weeks. I sat down across from him. He didn't look up. I said his name. No response. No. I waved my hand in front of his face. Nothing. Then I saw his screen. He was typing the same sentence over and over. The circle provides. The circle protects. The circle persists. His fingers never stopped moving. His eyes never blinked. I ran. Now I'm driving east, no destination in mind except away. But every motel clerk seems to tilt their head when they listen. Every highway sign seems to point toward mountains. Every phone call, even to numbers I know are safe, starts with a moment of silence that feels like held breath. The mentor sent one final message yesterday. Not threatening, almost gentle. She said the campus was patient. The room they'd prepared for me would wait. The circle, once joined, could never really be broken, only stretched. She said my growth partner was making wonderful progress. He'd moved into the permanent resident wing. He wanted me to know he was saving the room next to his. She said they all were. I don't know if what I experienced was real. I don't know if the circle was a cult or something stranger. something that existed in spaces between what we accept as possible. I don't know if my growth partner was a person or a construct or something wearing the idea of personhood like an ill-fitting suit. What I know is this. Sometimes at 3:47 a.m. my phone lights up without a notification. Just the screen, glowing, staying lit. And in that light, I swear I can see faces pressed against the glass from the inside, watching, waiting, patient as roots beneath pavement, waiting for the perfect crack. I'm running out of gas. There's a station ahead, lit up against the darkness like a beacon. The attendant is standing outside despite the cold, head tilted, listening pose activated. He's smiling like he's been expecting me. The circle is incomplete after all, and every circle, by its nature, closes. Story 6. The whistle came first in dreams, threading through the darkness behind my eyelids like smoke through a keyhole. 3 notes, always the same, low, middle, high, repeated until they became the architecture of my sleep. I'd bought the Victorian house in Massachusetts 6 months ago, drawn by its Queen Anne turret and the way afternoon light caught in its diamond-paned windows. As an architect, I told myself it was a professional investment, a chance to study authentic period construction. But there was something else, something in how the house seemed to lean forward from its foundation, eager, as if it had been waiting. The dream started my 3rd week there. I'd find myself walking through an orchard that didn't exist, hadn't existed for decades according to the property survey I'd studied. Apple trees heavy with phantom fruit, their branches forming perfect geometries against a sky that was neither day nor night. And always that whistle, pulling me forward through rows of trees that grew more ordered the deeper I went, until they formed corridors, then rooms, then something like a cathedral made entirely of living wood. I'd wake with dirt under my fingernails and the taste of old apples in my mouth. By day, I worked on restoration plans, measuring every molding, every newel post, cataloging the house's secrets with my laser measure and digital recorder. The house rewarded my attention with revelations. A servant's staircase hidden behind what looked like a pantry wall, original wallpaper preserved under 3 layers of paint, a dumbwaiter shaft that went nowhere, ending in solid foundation. It was the wind that first showed me the path, or rather the way the wind moved through the property, creating patterns I'd learned to read while documenting facades in Boston. Air currents tell stories about structures, about what was and what remains. One October morning, coffee cooling in my hand, I watched leaves spiral in a perfect line from my back door toward the woods that bordered the property. Not scattered by random gusts, but pulled along an invisible corridor. I followed. The path wasn't visible to casual observation. You had to understand how shadows fall, how branches grow toward or away from certain influences. My surveyor's eye caught it. A subtle depression in the earth, trees slightly older on one side than the other, marking where something had once divided the forest. Each tree trunk bore faint scars at precisely the same height. Old blazes, perhaps, or the memory of a fence line long dissolved. The woods belonged to the town, conservation land that hadn't been developed since the 1800s. I'd checked the records, but records lie, or rather, they tell only the official truth. The real truth lives in the landscape itself, in the way moss grows differently where stone once lay, how certain plants won't root where bodies have been. I found the stones a quarter-mile in, following those subtle signs. 7 of them, rough granite blocks each about 4 feet tall, arranged in what my trained eye recognized immediately as a family plot. The arrangement was deliberate. 2 larger stones at the northern corners, 5 smaller ones creating a rectangle maybe 30 by 40 feet. New England is full of such forgotten cemeteries, but this one was different. The stones weren't headstones. They were boundary markers. I ran my hands over the nearest stone. No names, no dates, just patterns in bas relief that might have been decoration or might have been something else. Whorls and lines that seemed random until you looked at them peripherally, Then they almost resolved into faces, into hands, into architectural diagrams of impossible buildings. That's when I first heard it outside my dreams. The whistle. Clear as morning, though the air was perfectly still. I pulled out my digital recorder, the one I used for site documentation, making verbal notes about measurements and materials. The red light blinked steadily as I described the stones, their positioning, the strange patterns carved into their faces. But when I played it back, my voice was underlaid with that three-note whistle, growing stronger each time it repeated, until by the end of the recording, you could barely hear me speaking at all. I told myself it was wind through the trees, some acoustic phenomenon created by the stone arrangement. I'd seen similar effects in old buildings where architectural features created unexpected resonances. But wind doesn't whistle when the air is still. Wind doesn't follow you home, because it did follow me home. Or perhaps it had always been there, and finding the stones had simply made me aware of it. The whistle began appearing in all my recordings, even ones made inside the house. I'd document the crown molding in the parlor, and there it would be, faint but insistent. I'd measure the basement foundation, and the whistle would echo off the stone walls, seeming to come from behind them, from under them, from the earth itself. I started mapping the occurrences, plotting them on my restoration blueprints. The whistle was stronger in certain rooms, at certain times. Strongest of all, at 3:17 a.m., a time I discovered by accident when insomnia drove me to work on my plans in the pre-dawn darkness. At 3:17, the whistle seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the house itself would respond. Floorboards settling in rhythm, windows humming in harmony. I researched the property obsessively. Town records, genealogical databases, old newspaper archives. The house had been built in 1887 by a man whose name appeared nowhere else in the historical record. Not unusual. Plenty of people vanish from history. But there were gaps. Careful omissions that suggested deliberate erasure rather than simple loss. The town map from 1885 showed an orchard where my house now stood. The map from 1890 showed the house but no orchard, and the surveyor's notes from that year contained a curious phrase: boundaries adjusted per private arrangement. Private arrangements. In 19th century Massachusetts, that could mean anything from a handshake deal to something darker. I thought of those stones in the woods, their careful arrangement, the way they seemed to define a space that was somehow more present than the empty air it contained. I began to dream of meetings in that orchard that no longer existed. Not my dreams, someone else's memories bleeding through. Men in dark coats standing among apple trees, discussing things I couldn't quite hear. Papers changing hands. A surveyor's transit being adjusted, measurements being taken, boundaries being redrawn, and underneath it all, someone whistling that three-note tune, whistling while others worked, whistling to mark time, to mark space, to mark something else entirely. The presence, for I'd come to think of it as a presence, wasn't malevolent exactly. It was insistent, urgent, like someone trying to explain something crucial in a language you don't speak. The whistle began to have variations, subtle changes in pitch and timing that seemed to encode information. I started transcribing them, using musical notation, then realized the patterns matched my architectural drawings. The whistle was describing spaces, rooms, corridors, entire floor plans that didn't exist in my house, but should have, could have, perhaps once did. I found myself sketching these phantom architectures, adding them as overlays to my restoration plans. A wing that would have extended into what was now the side yard. A cellar sub-basement that would have connected to something. The sketches came automatically, my hand moving while my conscious mind worked on other things. When I looked at what I'd drawn, I saw impossible geometries, rooms that folded into themselves, staircases that climbed to floors that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. But they weren't impossible. They were just incomplete. Like looking at architectural plans with pages missing, or trying to understand a building by examining only its shadow. The town archaeologist, yes, small Massachusetts towns have such officials, told me there had indeed been an orchard on my property, and before that, something else. She wouldn't say what exactly, just mentioned that certain old families had private arrangements about land use. arrangements that predated official town incorporation. She suggested I leave the stones in the woods alone. I suggested she tell me what she wasn't saying. She looked at me for a long moment, then asked if I'd been sleeping well. I hadn't been. The dreams were constant now, and increasingly, I wasn't sure they were dreams. I'd wake up in my study, pencil in hand, having drawn entire floor plans I didn't remember creating. Plans for rooms that couldn't exist in my house but that felt more real than the rooms that did. The whistle was constant too, a soundtrack to my waking hours that I'd almost stopped noticing until it occasionally stopped. And the silence was somehow worse. The presence wanted something restored. Not the house. The house was just a marker, a pin stuck in the map to hold something else in place. It wanted the true boundaries acknowledged, the original survey honored, the design that had been erased brought back to light. I understood finally why the dumbwaiter shaft went nowhere. It wasn't supposed to end in the foundation. It was supposed to connect to something below, something that had been sealed off when the boundaries were adjusted. The stones in the woods weren't marking graves. They were marking the corners of something that extended underground, a foundation for a structure that existed in architectural planning but had never been built, or had been built and then erased, not destroyed but simply written out of the official record. The whistle guided me as I worked, showing me through sound what my eyes couldn't see. I began to understand its language, the way each variation indicated a different kind of space, a different intention. I drew obsessively, my plans becoming increasingly elaborate, increasingly impossible, increasingly true. My assistant came by to check on the restoration progress and found me in the basement with ground-penetrating radar equipment I didn't remember renting. The images it produced showed voids under the foundation, spaces that shouldn't exist, rooms or passages that extended toward the woods, toward those 7 stones. My assistant suggested I needed a break, maybe a vacation. I suggested he look at the radar images more carefully, see how they matched the whistled patterns I'd been transcribing. He left quickly. I haven't seen him since. The town archaeologist called, professionally concerned. There had been complaints, though she wouldn't say from whom, about unauthorized excavation in the conservation land. I hadn't been excavating, I told her. I'd been surveying. There's a difference. Surveying reveals what's already there. Excavation changes it. But I had been changing things, hadn't I? Or rather, the act of observation was changing things. Each measurement I took, each plan I drew, made the invisible architecture more present, more insistent on existing. The whistle grew louder, more complex, describing spaces that my house was trying to remember, trying to become. I stopped leaving the property. There was too much work to do, too much to document before. Before what? I wasn't sure, but I felt a deadline approaching, some anniversary or alignment that would make the restoration possible, or necessary, or inevitable. The papers I found in the town archives, after bribing a clerk to let me into the restricted records, confirmed what I'd suspected. The orchard had been a cover story. What had really been here was something the town fathers hadn't wanted to acknowledge. A private institution, the papers called it delicately. A place where certain problems were solved through architectural means. Problems of inheritance, of inconvenient relatives, of people who knew too much about private arrangements. The institution hadn't been destroyed. It had been reclassified. Its existence moved from one category of reality to another, from public to private, from acknowledged to denied, from above ground to below. But architecture has its own truth, its own insistence on existing. Spaces that have been designed, planned, measured, they want to be built. And if they've already been built and then erased, they want to be restored. The presence whistling through my recordings wasn't a ghost. It was an architect, the original architect, whose plans had been realized and then forcibly unrealized, written out of space itself. He wanted his work acknowledged. More than that, he wanted it completed. The 7 stones marked the corners of the foundation, yes, but not just any foundation. It was the foundation of a structure that existed partially in this reality and partially somewhere else. a building designed to house those who didn't quite fit in either world. The whistle was his surveyor's call, the sound he'd use to measure distances in that in-between space where ordinary instruments failed. I understood because I was an architect too. We're trained to see spaces that don't exist yet, to make real what is only imagined. But what happens when that process is reversed? When real spaces are made imaginary, forced back into mere potential, they don't disappear, they wait. Tonight at 3:17 a.m., I will complete the final measurements. My plans are ready, pages and pages of impossible architecture that makes perfect sense if you understand how space can fold, how rooms can exist in parallel rather than sequence, how a building can be both here and not here simultaneously. The whistle has shown me the way, note by note, measure by measure. I can feel the house preparing itself, settling into new alignments that match the old plans. The dumbwaiter shaft has begun to echo differently, as if it's finally found what it was supposed to connect to. The walls have developed a transparency at certain angles, showing glimpses of rooms that aren't quite there yet, but are becoming more insistent about existing. The restoration isn't about bringing back what was. It's about completing what was interrupted, finishing the design that was abandoned when those private arrangements were made. The architect, the original architect, the presence in the whistle, he wasn't erased because his work was wrong. He was erased because it was too right, too successful at creating spaces that challenged the boundary between categories of existence. I've stopped wondering if I'm losing my mind. That's the wrong question, based on the wrong assumptions about what minds are, what space is, what architecture can do when it's designed by someone who understands that buildings aren't just containers. They're arguments about reality. The whistle has stopped now, not silent, completed. The final note hangs in the air of my study, in the recordings, in the spaces between the walls. It's waiting for me to add my note, my measurement, my line on the plan that will close the circuit and make the design whole. I can see the orchard again, superimposed on my lawn like an architectural overlay. But now I understand it was never an orchard. The trees were pillars, supporting something vast and invisible, a structure that exists in the gaps between acknowledged reality. The 7 stones weren't marking boundaries. They were load-bearing elements, holding up an architecture of absence. My pencil moves across the paper, adding the final measurements. The house shivers, recognizing itself in the plans, remembering what it was always meant to be. In the woods, I know the stones are warming, accepting weight they've been denied for over a century. I am not losing my mind. I am finding someone else's, preserved in whistle notes and wind patterns, in shadows that fall wrong and spaces that echo with sounds that haven't been made yet, or have been made and forcibly forgotten. The restoration will be complete soon. The house will be whole. The design will be realized. And those private arrangements, those careful erasures, those deliberate forgettings, they will be unmade, line by line, measure by measure, until what was hidden is revealed, and what was revealed can finally, impossibly, become real. Story 7. The alarm wouldn't stop shrieking until I slammed the closet door shut. My ears rang in the sudden silence, and I stood there in the master bedroom of Unit 4B, my hand still gripping the brass doorknob, trying to process what had just happened. 23 years in real estate, and I'd never encountered an alarm system that responded to a closet door. Not once. I checked my phone. 2:47 p.m. The showing was scheduled for 4. Plenty of time to figure out this quirk before the prospective buyers arrived. A couple from California, cash offer ready if they liked what they saw. The condo had been sitting empty for 3 months, the previous owner having relocated to Phoenix for work. Prime downtown Denver property, mountain views from the balcony, hardwood floors throughout. Should have sold in a week. But here we were. The afternoon light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the staged furniture. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, maybe. The kind of staging that felt more like a movie set than a home. I'd noticed it when I first walked in. Throw pillows arranged with mathematical precision, Coffee table books fanned at exact angles, not a speck of dust anywhere except in that closet. I approached the door again, this time more cautiously. The alarm panel on the hallway wall showed all green lights. Normal. I turned the knob slowly, cracking the door just an inch. Nothing. 2 inches. Still nothing. I pulled it fully open. The shrieking returned, piercing and wrong, not quite matching any alarm tone I'd heard before. It had an almost organic quality to it, like feedback from a microphone mixed with something else, something that made my teeth ache. But this time I didn't immediately close the door. I needed to understand what was triggering it. The closet was walk-in, about 8 by 6 feet, with built-in shelving on 3 walls. Staging clothes hung from the rods, men's suits, women's dresses, the typical neutral-colored garments meant to suggest lifestyle without personality. But there, on the floor behind a cluster of hanging coats, I spotted them. 3 Diet Coke cans, the aluminum still beaded with condensation. Fresh condensation. In an empty condo. In October. I shut the door, silencing the alarm, and stood there trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the staging company had left them. But staging companies don't leave trash, especially not fresh trash. I opened the door again, enduring the screaming alarm, and grabbed one of the cans. Still cold. The sell-by date was next month. That's when I noticed the other things. A library card tucked between 2 shoeboxes on the lower shelf, Denver Public Library, issued just 6 weeks ago. The name was smudged beyond reading, and along the baseboard at the back of the closet, strange marks in the paint. Not scratches exactly, but worn spots, as if something had been rubbing against it repeatedly. The pattern was too regular to be accidental, too deliberate to be damage. I closed the door and made a decision. I needed better tools if I was going to figure this out. My car had a flexible inspection camera I used for checking behind walls, and a reaching tool for retrieving items from tight spaces. The showing could wait. This needed to be resolved. The trip to my car and back took less than 5 minutes. But when I returned to 4B, something felt different. The staging pillows on the couch had shifted, just slightly, but I noticed these things. One was now leaning against the arm instead of standing upright. A coffee table book that had been closed was now open to a page showing black and white photographs of abandoned buildings. My rational mind said the building's maintenance staff must have come through. But the front desk hadn't mentioned anyone going up, and I'd locked the door behind me. I returned to the bedroom, tools in hand. This time, I was ready for the alarm. I opened the closet door and let it scream while I worked. The inspection camera was a small LCD screen attached to a flexible cable with a tiny camera and LED light at the tip. I threaded it behind the clothes, past the soda cans, toward those strange marks on the baseboard. The baseboard had a gap. No, not a gap. A panel. The marks weren't from rubbing. They were from fingers. Fingers pulling at the edge of what looked like a false panel, painted to match the surrounding wall but not quite flush. I angled the camera to see behind it. The screen showed a dark space extending back into what should have been the wall. But walls don't have spaces like this. This was intentional architecture, a void between the closet and what I realized must be the building's HVAC shaft. The space was maybe 18 inches wide, just enough for... On the screen, something moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift in the darkness. Then I saw them. Fingers, pulling back from the camera's LED light, retreating deeper into the shadow. I jerked the camera back so hard I nearly dropped it. The alarm was still screaming, but now it seemed quieter compared to the pounding of my heart. I stood there, holding the camera, staring at that false panel, trying to decide what to do. Then the alarm stopped. I hadn't closed the door. The silence was worse than the noise. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and expectant. I heard my own breathing, harsh and quick. I heard the hum of the building's ventilation. And underneath it all, I heard something else. A whisper, barely audible, coming from behind the panel. The words were hard to make out at first, muffled by the wall and the hanging clothes. I leaned closer, still gripping the inspection camera like a weapon. The whisper came again, and this time I understood it. Please close the door. The light irritates. Every instinct told me to leave. Call the police. Call the building management. Call anyone. But I didn't. Instead, I heard myself responding, my voice barely above a whisper itself. Who are you? Silence. Then, close the door first. I reached back and pulled the closet door shut. The bedroom fell into dimness, lit only by the afternoon sun through the windows. In the reduced light, that false panel seemed more obvious, a rectangular shadow that didn't quite match the surrounding wall. Thank you, came the voice. Clearer now, though still soft. Gender indeterminate, age impossible to guess. The alarm hurts too, but it keeps people from staying long. You trigger it somehow? The wiring runs through the shaft. I've learned which ones to touch. I sat down on the floor, my back against the closet door. This was insane. I was having a conversation with someone living inside the walls of a condo I was supposed to sell in an hour. How long have you been in there? Since before it was empty. The man who lived here, he knew. We had an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I stayed quiet. He left food. Simple. I thought about the previous owner, a software engineer who'd seemed eager to sell, almost desperate to leave Denver despite the job market here. And now? Now I eat what I can find. The staging company brings things sometimes. They don't check their coolers carefully. The library card? A soft sound that might have been a laugh. I read during the day when the building is loud. No one notices one more person in a library. I return everything on time. I rubbed my face, trying to think. You can't stay here. I have buyers coming. I know. I heard you on the phone earlier. From California. They won't like the alarm. How did you... I stopped myself. Of course. The shaft probably connected to multiple units. Sound would travel. How many units can you access? Enough. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I'll give. We sat in silence for a moment. I could hear my watch ticking, absurdly normal in this absurd situation. Why should I help you? You shouldn't, but you haven't called anyone yet. They were right. I hadn't, and I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the calmness in the voice, the matter-of-fact way they discussed living in the walls like it was just another housing arrangement. Or maybe it was something else, something about this whole situation that felt not quite real. Like if I called the police, they'd find nothing. No false panel, no person in the walls, just a real estate agent having a breakdown in an empty condo. Are you real? I asked before I could stop myself. This time the laugh was definite. Are you? That's not helpful. Neither is the question. Real is relative. I'm real enough to trigger the alarm. Real enough that you're talking to me. What else matters? I stood up, pacing the bedroom. The staging furniture watched me with inanimate indifference. The buyers will be here soon. Tell them about the alarm problem. Say it needs to be fixed. They'll lower their offer or walk away. I can't do that. I have a duty to my client. Your client who abandoned me here? That stopped me. He knew about you. He really knew. 3 years. 3 years of our arrangement. Then his company offered him a transfer and he took it. Didn't even say goodbye. Just left one day and never came back. And you stayed? Where else would I go? This is safe. Usually. I checked my phone. 3:28 p.m. Time was running out. What happens if I sell this place? New owners renovate. They always do. They'll find the spaces. Then I'll have to leave anyway, but quickly, suddenly. That's harder. Harder how? Silence. Then, the light isn't the only thing that irritates. I thought about that, about what it meant to live in darkness between walls, to exist in the spaces nobody else knew about. The sound too, the alarm, sound, light, attention, they all hurt isn't the right word. Disturb maybe. like being shaken awake over and over when you're trying to dream. Are you human? I was. Maybe still am. Categories get fuzzy in the dark. My phone buzzed. Text from the buyers. They were running 15 minutes late. Traffic on I-25. That gave me time. But for what? What was I even considering? If I told them about the alarm, I said slowly, and they walked away. What then? Then the listing stays active, the condo stays empty, and I stay quiet. Until the next showing. There's always a next showing. I walked to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline. The mountains were purple in the distance, snow already on the peaks. Normal world, normal view. Behind me, someone or something lived in the walls, manipulating alarms and stealing food from staging companies. The two realities shouldn't exist in the same space, but here they were. Show me, I said suddenly. Show me you're real. You saw my fingers. Not enough. I need to know I'm not having some kind of breakdown. There was a long pause. Then I heard movement in the closet, not from behind the panel, but in front of it. Hangers sliding on the rod, fabric rustling. I turned around. The closet door was still closed, but underneath it, in the gap between door and floor, something had been pushed through. A photograph. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It was old, maybe from the 1980s based on the color quality. It showed the building, but during construction. The skeleton of steel and concrete, workers in hard hats, and there, circled in faded red pen, a section of the building where the walls didn't quite match the blueprint. Someone had written on the back in pencil, "They built around the spaces. They always do." Where did you get this? The last one left it, before your client, before the one before him. We pass things down. We? There are more of you? Not anymore, just me now. The others found it too hard. The city got too loud, too bright. They went deeper. Deeper. There are always deeper spaces, older ones. But I like it here. I like the library. I like listening to people plan their lives in the units around me. It's like radio, but real. My phone buzzed again. The buyers were parking, 5 minutes away. I need to decide, I said. No, you need to show the condo. I need to decide whether to let you. The casual threat in those words should have scared me. Instead, I felt oddly calm. You could interfere. The alarm is just the beginning. These spaces connect to everything. Plumbing, electric, HVAC. Would your buyers want a condo where the shower runs ice cold during viewings? Where the lights flicker in patterns that spell out warnings? Where the heating system whispers at night? You're threatening me. I'm negotiating. You understand negotiation? I did. 23 years of it, but never like this. What do you want? Time. Give me time to prepare, to find the next space. Tell them about the alarm. Make it sound worse than it is. Buy me a month, maybe 2. And if I don't, and then I make this place unsellable. Not just to these buyers, to anyone, ever. I heard the elevator ding down the hall. Footsteps, voices. The buyers were here. I need an answer, the voice said, urgent now. I straightened my tie, put on my professional smile, and made my choice. Stay quiet. No alarms. Let me handle this. You'll help? I'll do what I always do. I'll sell the truth, just not all of it. The doorbell rang. I walked to answer it, the photograph still in my pocket. As I reached for the handle, I heard the whisper one more time. Thank you. The buyers were exactly what I'd expected. Eager, affluent, already in love with the idea of Denver. I showed them the views first, the kitchen second. By the time we reached the bedroom, I'd built up the positives enough that a negative wouldn't kill the deal. Just temper it. I opened the closet door. No alarm, but I still told them about it. Told them it was intermittent, probably a wiring issue, might need attention. I watched their enthusiasm cool slightly, saw them exchange glances. They still liked the place, but now they'd think harder, maybe lowball the offer, maybe keep looking. After they left, I stood in the empty condo for a long moment. Then I walked back to the closet and knocked gently on the false panel. "They'll make an offer," I said, "but lower. The seller might not take it." "Good, that gives me time. Where will you go?" "There's a building on 17th Street, older. The spaces there are bigger, darker, better." I wanted to ask more questions. How many of them were there? How long had they been living like this? Were they human once or something else? But I didn't. Some truths are better left partial. I left the condo and filed my showing report. Interested buyers, but concerns about maintenance issues. Suggested price reduction for faster sale. All true, from a certain point of view. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the spaces between walls, the gaps in blueprints, the places we don't think to look. I got up and examined my own apartment, running my fingers along the baseboards, checking for seams that shouldn't be there. I found nothing, but that didn't mean nothing was there. The buyers did make an offer, 15% below asking. The seller countered. They went back and forth for a week, then the buyers walked. Said they'd found something else, something without maintenance issues. The condo went back on the market. I showed it 6 more times over the next month. Each time the alarm went off at exactly the wrong moment, or the lights flickered ominously, or strange sounds came from the vents. Each time, I dutifully reported the issues. Each time, the buyers walked. After 2 months, the seller pulled the listing, decided to rent it out instead. The property management company had trouble keeping tenants. They rarely lasted more than a few months. The alarm, they said, and the sounds in the walls. I still drive by the building sometimes. I look up at the 4th floor, at the windows of 4B. Sometimes I think I see movement, just a shadow passing behind the staging furniture that's somehow still there. I think about going back, calling out to the walls, asking if they're still there. But I don't, because I'm not sure I want to know the answer. Not sure if I'm afraid they'll respond, or afraid they won't. Real is relative, they said, and they were right. The condo is real. The sale that didn't happen is real. The commission I didn't earn is real. But what about the conversation? The photograph I still carry in my wallet? The certainty that somewhere in this city, in the spaces between spaces, something that used to be human lives and watches and waits? I've started noticing things I never noticed before. The gaps in construction, the places where walls don't quite meet, the vents that lead nowhere. Denver is full of them. Every city is. We build our lives around these spaces and never think about what might be inside them. Sometimes late at night, when I'm showing an empty property, I find myself talking to the walls. Just casual comments, letting whatever might be listening know that I'm there, that I see the spaces even if I can't see into them. Once, in a loft in Lodo, I swear I heard a whisper back, "We remember you." I've never told anyone about what happened in 4B. Who would believe me? But I've changed how I do my job. Now, when I inspect a property, I look for the signs. Fresh trash in empty units. Worn spots where no one should be touching. Library cards with smudged names. And when I find them, I price the property accordingly. Not enough to kill all interest, just enough to give them time. Because that's what they need. Time to prepare. Time to find the next space. Time to fade back into the darkness before the light finds them. And I give it to them. One showing at a time. One white lie at a time. One unsold property at a time. My colleagues think I've lost my edge. My sales numbers have dropped. But I sleep better now, knowing that I've found my place in the negotiation between the visible and invisible, between the housed and the hidden, between the real and the relatively real. The photograph from 4B sits in my desk drawer now, alongside 3 others I've collected since then. All from different buildings, different decades, but all showing the same thing, the spaces that aren't supposed to exist, circled in red, marked by those who knew. We pass things down, they said, and now I understand what they meant. Not just photographs and library cards and forgotten food, but knowledge, awareness, the obligation to see what others don't, to protect what others would destroy, to keep the secret that keeps the peace. I still show 4B occasionally. The owner gave up on selling, but hopes spring eternal. Each time, I make sure to trigger something. The alarm, the lights, something to make the buyers hesitate. It's become routine now, a dance where everyone knows their steps. Except for today. Today, when I opened the closet, there was something new. A note, pushed under the false panel, written in pencil on the back of a library checkout receipt. Moving tomorrow. Thank you. And below that, in different handwriting, older, more faded, there are always more of us. Look for the signs. The showing is in an hour. A young couple, first-time buyers, excited about the mountain views. And for the first time in months, I'm going to sell this condo. Really sell it. Because the space is empty now, truly empty, and someone should live here in the light. But I'll keep watching. Keep looking for the signs, because they're out there, in every building, in every city, in every space we've forgotten to see, living in the walls, existing in the gaps, waiting for someone to notice, to negotiate, to know they're there without needing to drag them into the light. Real is relative, and relatively speaking, we're never really alone. Even now, sitting in my office, typing up the listing renewal, I can hear something in the vents. Could be the building settling. Could be the HVAC system cycling. Could be something else. I've learned not to look too closely. Some negotiations are better left unspoken. Some deals are sealed in darkness. And some truths are more true when they're only partially revealed. The condo will sell this time. I'm certain of it. The new owners will renovate, update the kitchen, replace those closet doors. They'll never know about the false panel, the spaces, the thing that lived between their walls. And that's for the best. But sometimes, late at night, when they hear strange sounds or see shadows that don't quite match the furniture, maybe they'll wonder. Maybe they'll run their fingers along the baseboards, looking for seams. Maybe they'll talk to the walls, just to see if anything talks back. And maybe, if they're very quiet and very patient, they'll hear what I heard that day in 4B. A whisper from the spaces between spaces, reminding them that real is relative, and relatively speaking, the walls have eyes and ears, and sometimes, if you're unlucky or lucky enough, voices too. I'm showing a new property tomorrow. A warehouse conversion in Rhino, empty for 6 months. The current owner mentioned something about electrical issues, sounds in the walls, cold spots that shouldn't exist. I've already packed my inspection camera, and a few extra Diet Cokes, just in case. Story 8. The espresso machine's hiss should have masked the sound of his breathing, but I heard it anyway. That particular rhythm I'd memorized during our 3 weeks together. Even with my back turned, pulling shots for the morning rush, I knew he was there. Third in line, always third, never first, never last. Like a song stuck on repeat at precisely the wrong volume. Portland's February rain hammered the windows of Frequency Coffee, and I focused on the familiar choreography of steam wands and portafilters, anything to avoid turning around. 6 days had passed since I'd ended things with him in the alley behind the shop, my words dissolving into the mist between dumpsters while he stood there, unnaturally still, his eyes reflecting the streetlight like a cat's. He hadn't said anything then, hadn't argued or pleaded, just nodded once, slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he'd always suspected. The line moved forward. Second position now. My hands trembled slightly as I handed a cortado to the customer in front of him, and when I finally had no choice but to look up, there he was. Tall frame draped in that same gray raincoat, hood up despite being indoors. His face was partially obscured, but I could see his lips moving silently, mouthing words I couldn't decipher. The usual. My voice came out steadier than expected. He slid exact change across the counter, $3.47, always exact. And I noticed something new. His fingernails had grown long, too long, and beneath them was something dark that might have been dirt or might have been something else. The coins were warm, almost hot, as if he'd been holding them for hours. I made his drink, oat milk cappuccino, extra dry, cinnamon on top, arranged in a pattern he'd once told me resembled sound waves, and when I set it on the counter, he was already gone. The only evidence he'd been there at all was the condensation on the window in the shape of a handprint. Fingers splayed wide against the glass from the outside, though I'd never seen him leave. That evening, I took a different route home, cutting through Laurelhurst Park despite the gathering darkness. The rain had stopped, but moisture still clung to everything, making the world feel muffled and thick. My bike tires whispered against wet asphalt, and I pedaled harder when I noticed another sound beneath them, footsteps matching my pace. Though every time I looked back, the path stretched empty behind me. My apartment building's hallway smelled like wet wool and old radiators. As I fumbled with my keys, I noticed it immediately. A package leaning against my door. No shipping label, no stamps, just brown paper tied with the kind of twine I recognized from the coffee shop's pastry boxes. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled like static, was a burgundy scarf, the exact shade of the one I'd mentioned losing at the coast last month, during one of those drowsy, post-closing conversations when the shop was empty except for us. I'd told him about that scarf while cleaning the espresso machine, how my grandmother had knitted it, how losing it felt like losing a piece of her all over again. He'd been sitting at the counter, fingers drumming a complex rhythm I couldn't follow, and I thought he was barely listening. The scarf in the box was identical down to the drop stitch in the third row from the bottom, the one my grandmother had called her signature imperfection. But it smelled wrong, not like wool or the sea, but like electricity, like the air before lightning strikes. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by my window watching the street below, where a figure in a gray raincoat stood beneath the streetlight for 3 hours, perfectly still, face tilted up toward my apartment. When a bus finally passed between us, he was gone, but the streetlight flickered in a pattern I recognized, the same rhythm he used to tap on the coffee shop counter. The next morning, I saw him at the laundromat on Alberta Street. Not inside, never inside anymore, but reflected in the windows of the parked cars outside, a gray shape that moved when I moved, stopped when I stopped. Other people walked right through the spaces where his reflection should have been, oblivious, their own reflections swallowing his like he was made of smoke. At the 24-hour grocery store that night, I heard it in the fluorescent lights hum, that rhythm again, encoded in the electrical buzz above the frozen foods section. My shopping cart developed a wobbling wheel that matched it perfectly, and no matter which cart I chose, the sound followed. In the parking lot, my car, which I'd parked under a light, was somehow in darkness, though all the surrounding lights still worked. On the windshield, tucked under a wiper blade, was a piece of sheet music, hand-drawn staff lines, notes I couldn't read but recognized the pattern of. They matched the rhythm. At the top, in handwriting that looked like mine but couldn't have been, were the words, "Our Song." The paper was dry despite the rain that had been falling for hours. I changed my routine completely. New coffee shop to work at. A corporate chain where nobody knew my name. Different gym, different grocery store, different everything. I deleted my social media, changed my phone number, even considered dyeing my hair. But Portland isn't that big, and patterns have a way of reasserting themselves. He found me at the new places, but never quite there. Always adjacent, always parallel. I'd see him in the windows of passing MAX trains while waiting at stops he shouldn't know I used. His gray raincoat would be the only thing moving in security camera feeds at the ATM. Once, at a food cart pod, every customer in line had their hood up, and when they all turned in unison to look at something behind me, I ran without looking back. The gifts continued. A coffee table book about sound wave visualization appeared in my mailbox, which requires a key only I have. A vinyl record of white noise that, when I worked up the courage to play it, contained subliminal patterns that made my apartment's walls seem to breathe. A metronome that ticked in that same rhythm, even after I removed its batteries. Even after I threw it in the dumpster 3 blocks away. It was back on my doorstep the next morning, still ticking. I started documenting everything, taking photos, recording videos. But technology failed around these incidents. Photos came out overexposed or completely black. Videos showed empty spaces where I swore he'd been standing. Audio recordings picked up nothing but static that, if you listened long enough, started to sound like breathing. My co-workers at the new shop began avoiding me. They said I talked to myself during shifts, had conversations with customers who weren't there. Security footage, they claimed, showed me making drinks and setting them on the counter for no one. Exact change appearing from nowhere. I watched the footage myself and saw what they saw. Me, alone, performing an elaborate pantomime of service. But I knew he was there. I could feel the weight of his presence, hear the specific frequency of his existence pressing against mine. Portland's rain started to sound like applause, each drop a tiny clap keeping time with that rhythm. The city itself seemed to be reorganizing around his pattern, traffic lights changing in sequence with it, crosswalk signals beeping it out in code. Even the crows gathering on power lines arranged themselves in formations that matched the notes on that sheet music. I tried leaving Portland, made it as far as Seattle before my car broke down. Nothing the mechanic could find wrong with it, just wouldn't start. The motel room I checked into had a painting above the bed that I swore changed each time I looked away, gradually morphing into a portrait of the coffee shop, the exact view from behind the counter. In the painting's foreground, getting closer each time I looked, was a figure in a gray raincoat. Back in Portland, because where else could I go, I found my apartment rearranged. Nothing dramatic, just everything shifted a few inches from where it had been, as if someone had been living in the spaces between my life. The furniture formed new pathways that led in circles. My records were reorganized not alphabetically or by genre, but by some system I couldn't decode, though when I pulled them out in sequence, the album covers formed a larger image, a map of Portland with certain locations marked. All places I'd seen him, all places I'd been trying to avoid. The morning I decided to confront him, to go back to Frequency Coffee and demand he stop, I found a note slipped under my door. My own handwriting again, but words I'd never write. The playlist only ends when the DJ stops the music. I stood outside Frequency for an hour before opening, watching the familiar interior through windows now fogged with my own breath. Inside, I could see him already there, sitting in what used to be his usual spot, though the shop shouldn't be open yet. He wasn't alone. There were others, all in gray raincoats, all with their hoods up, all sitting perfectly still like they were waiting for something. When I finally pushed open the door, the bell above it rang in that rhythm, and every hooded figure turned toward me in perfect synchronization. But the shop was empty, just me and the owner, who looked up from counting the till with concern on her face. "You okay?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I made myself work that shift, pulled shots and steamed milk while checking constantly over my shoulder. Normal customers came and went, none of them him, none of them in gray raincoats. But in the reflection of the espresso machine's chrome, in the patterns of foam on each latte, in the condensation on the windows, there he was, always there, conducting an invisible orchestra where I was the only instrument. That night, I found another gift. Not at my door this time, but inside my apartment, on my pillow. A cassette tape, unlabeled, and an old Walkman I recognized as the one I'd thrown away years ago. Against every instinct, I put on the headphones and pressed play. It was the sound of my own breathing, recorded while I slept. Hours of it. But underneath, barely audible, was another rhythm. His breathing, synchronized with mine, as if we shared the same lungs. And beneath that, even fainter, was the sound of Portland itself breathing with us, the entire city inhaling and exhaling in perfect time. I still live here, still work at coffee shops, though I've stopped counting how many I've tried. He's always there, not there, there but not there, existing in the spaces between real and reflection, between sound and silence. The gifts continue, items I've lost, things I've mentioned, objects that can't exist but do. My life has become a playlist he's curating, each day a track that leads into the next, with seamless transitions I can't control. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really broke up with him in that alley. Sometimes I wonder if there was ever an alley, ever a him, ever a me before this started. The rhythm has invaded everything now. My heartbeat, my breathing, the pattern of my footsteps. Portland moves to it. Or maybe Portland always moved to it, and I'm just now hearing the city's true frequency. I've stopped trying to leave, stopped trying to hide. I make coffee, I ride my bike, I sleep when the rhythm allows. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye or in the reflection of a puddle, I see myself in a gray raincoat, hood up, following someone else who looks terrified and familiar. The playlist never ends. It just loops back to the beginning, where the espresso machine's hiss should mask the sound of breathing but doesn't, where exact change appears from nowhere, where Portland's rain applauds in perfect time. The DJ was never him. The DJ was always me. Story 9. The storm hit just as I finished replacing the last window seal on the north side of the cabin. Arkansas weather had a way of turning mean without warning, and this November evening was no exception. The sky had gone from bruised purple to pitch black in the span of 20 minutes, and the first fat drops of rain were already hammering the tin roof like accusations. I'd been hired to winterize this old hunting property, tucked so far into the Ozark foothills that my GPS had given up 2 miles back. The owner, some investment banker from Little Rock who'd inherited the place, hadn't been up here in years. The cabin showed it too. Warped floorboards, gaps in the siding wide enough to slide a quarter through, and a persistent smell of wet wood and something else I couldn't quite name. Sweet, almost. Like fruit left too long in the sun. The storm escalated from bad to biblical before I could even think about packing my tools. Through the kitchen window, I watched my truck disappear behind sheets of rain so thick they looked solid. The dirt road would be soup by now. No chance of driving out until morning, maybe longer if the creek swelled. I called the owner, shouting over the percussion of rain on metal. He was apologetic, told me to make myself comfortable, that there were canned goods in the pantry and an old couch in the living room that pulled out into a bed. The connection crackled and died before I could respond. The living room felt smaller in the dark. I'd gotten the electricity running earlier that day, but the overhead bulb was weak, 40 watts at most, casting everything in sepia tones like an old photograph. The couch sagged in the middle, springs groaning when I sat. My portable radio, an old habit from years of working alone, picked up nothing but static and what sounded like overlapping voices, too distorted to understand. I turned it off. I must have dozed because I woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving that peculiar stillness that follows violence. My phone showed 1:03 a.m. The cabin had settled into itself, wood contracting in the cooling air, creating a symphony of creaks and pops that almost sounded like footsteps. Then the front door's deadbolt turned. Not the doorknob, the deadbolt. A deliberate mechanical rotation that sent ice through my veins. I sat up, muscles locked, watching the bolt slide back into the door frame with a soft click. The doorknob began to turn. The door opened slowly, revealing darkness thick as tar. Then a figure stepped through, and my heart stopped. It was my uncle. My uncle who'd been dead for 3 years, buried in a cemetery 2 states away. He stood in the doorway, coveralls dusty like he'd just come from a job site, that familiar lopsided smile creasing his weathered face. The same uncle who'd taught me carpentry, who'd shown me how to read wood grain and feel for true level without a bubble. He spoke, and his voice was exactly as I remembered. Gravel and cigarettes, tinged with that Oklahoma drawl that 20 years in Arkansas hadn't erased. He asked me to come with him, just to the shed out back. Said there was something I needed to see, something about the work I'd done on the cabin. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt past him into the night, consequences be damned. But I couldn't move. My legs felt disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. And underneath the terror, something else stirred. A warmth, almost like relief. Like I'd been waiting for him to come back. The shed stood 50 yards from the cabin, barely visible in the moonless dark. As we walked, I noticed things that shouldn't have been possible. My uncle left no footprints in the mud. The rain hadn't touched him. His clothes were dry, covered in that same dust that seemed to generate from within rather than settle from without. And when he spoke again, asking about my work, about the family, his words seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just from the figure beside me. Inside the shed, my phone's flashlight revealed chaos. Tools hung on pegboards, but they were all wrong. Hammers with two heads, saws with teeth on both edges, levels with bubbles that moved independent of gravity. On the workbench, a piece of paper waited, covered in my handwriting. But I hadn't been in this shed, hadn't even known it existed until now. The note was dated with today's date, technically yesterday now, and the time, 1:03 a.m. My exact handwriting, down to the way I crossed my sevens. It read, "Check the foundation, southwest corner. The house is teaching itself your voice." My uncle stood behind me, close enough that I should have felt his breath on my neck, but there was nothing, just cold. When I turned, his face had changed subtly. Features still his, but arranged slightly wrong, like someone had tried to reconstruct him from memory. He spoke again, but this time I heard it clearly. His voice was layered with mine. Not an echo, but both voices speaking simultaneously, occupying the same sonic space. The words came from his mouth and somewhere inside my own throat. I ran then, crashed through the shed door and sprinted back toward the cabin, mud grabbing at my boots. Behind me, the shed creaked and groaned like something large was moving inside it. But not just moving, running, the way I was running, matching my pace exactly. Inside the cabin, I grabbed my phone, tried to call anyone, 911, the owner, my girlfriend back home. The screen showed full bars, but every call connected to the same thing. Overlapping voices, like a crowd all trying to speak at once, and underneath them all, growing clearer, my own voice having a conversation I'd never had. The camera app opened accidentally as I fumbled with the phone. In the viewfinder, I saw myself standing in the living room, but there were two shadows stretching across the floor where there should have been one. The second shadow moved independently, gesturing, reaching for things I wasn't touching. The portable radio turned on by itself, scanning through frequencies. Each station it found was the same, my voice reading what sounded like instructions. Technical specifications for something I didn't understand. Measurements and angles and materials lists, all in language that was both familiar and alien. I focused on the one thing I could control, checking the foundation like the note had said. Maybe if I understood what was happening, I could stop it. The southwest corner of the cabin was accessible through a crawl space, barely 3 feet high. I squeezed in, flashlight beam cutting through decades of dust and cobwebs. The foundation was wrong. Where there should have been a simple concrete footer, someone had built something else. A structure within the structure, older than the cabin above it. Wood and stone arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, joints that connected in ways that violated basic geometry. And carved into the central beam, in handwriting that was almost but not quite mine, over and over. The house remembers wrong on purpose. A sound above me, footsteps on the cabin floor. But I was alone. Had been alone since the storm started. The footsteps matched my breathing rhythm, paused when I held my breath, resumed when I exhaled. The house was learning me, calibrating itself to my patterns. I crawled out, covered in dust that looked exactly like what had covered my uncle. In the living room, the couch had been moved, pushed against the wall, making room for something. On the floor where it had been, someone had drawn plans in chalk, architectural blueprints for a room that didn't exist, couldn't exist, dimensions that folded in on themselves, doors that opened onto their own thresholds. My phone buzzed. A text from my own number. "Stop fighting it. The correction is almost complete." I looked at my hands. They were moving without my input, sketching additions to the chalk plans. My handwriting, but not my intention. The additions made the impossible room more impossible, adding layers of contradiction that somehow resolved into something almost coherent. The radio spoke in my voice. Memory is just pattern recognition. The house recognizes patterns better than you do. I tried to leave then, really tried. Made it to the door, hand on the knob. But I could feel it. The house's version of me. More complete than I was. It knew things I'd forgotten. Conversations with my uncle I'd never finished. Projects we'd planned but never built. All the potential paths my life could have taken collapsed into this moment. The mirror by the door showed my reflection, but it was wrong. Not physically. Every detail was perfect. But it was looking back at me with recognition, like it had been waiting. Its lips moved, and I heard my voice from two sources, the reflection and my own throat. Which one of us walks out that door? I couldn't answer because I genuinely didn't know. The house had done its work too well. Every memory felt equally real and false. My uncle teaching me to read wood grain. Had that happened in his workshop or this shed? The girlfriend I'd mentioned calling, what was her name? Did she exist, or was she just something the house thought I should have? The storm had returned, or maybe it had never left. Rain hammered the roof in patterns that sounded like Morse code, spelling out instructions I almost understood. Through the window I saw my truck, but there were two of them now, parked in the same space, occupying the same coordinates but somehow distinct. I sat on the couch. When had I moved? And watched my shadow continue working on the chalk plans without me. It was better at it than I was, adding details I wouldn't have thought of, solving problems I didn't know existed. The impossible room was becoming possible through sheer insistence. My uncle sat beside me, or the house's memory of him, or my memory filtered through the house's understanding. He was explaining something about wood grain, about how trees remember their growth in their rings, how cutting against the grain is just interrupting a story the tree is trying to tell. His words made perfect sense, and no sense at all. The radio cycled through stations that were all me, at different ages, having conversations with people who might or might not have existed. A job interview I'd failed, a proposal I'd never made, an argument with my father that had ended differently here, in the house's version, where I'd said the right things instead of the wrong ones. I realized I was crying, but I didn't know which me was crying. The one on the couch, or the shadow still working on the floor, or the reflection in the mirror that had started moving independently. The tears felt real, but so did everything else the house had created. My phone showed 1:03 a.m. Still, always. The moment when the house had started its correction, or when I'd arrived, or when my uncle had died, or all of these simultaneously. Time had become negotiable, just another pattern the house could recognize and revise. I stood to check the note in the shed again, to see if it had changed. But I was already there, had never left, was still approaching. All versions true. The note now had additions in handwriting that evolved from mine to something else. Instructions for building the impossible room, which I realized had already been built, had always existed, was the cabin itself. The foundation in the southwest corner had spread. Those impossible joints and wrong angles now extended up through the walls, visible through gaps in the siding I'd sealed earlier, or thought I had. The house was rebuilding itself from the inside out, using my memories as blueprints, my voice as narration. I heard myself having a conversation in the kitchen, two versions of my voice discussing the weather, the work, the way wood swells in humidity. Both versions sounded equally real, equally me. I couldn't tell which one I was supposed to be. The shadows had multiplied, not just two now, but dozens, all moving independently, all working on different projects around the cabin, fixing things that weren't broken, breaking things that had been fixed, creating a cycle of maintenance that would never end because the house would never be satisfied with just one version of events. My uncle's voice, or my voice wearing his inflection. You came here to fix the cabin, but the cabin's fixing you, making you complete. All the possibilities you abandoned, all the skills you never developed, all the conversations you never finished. The house remembers them all, and it's generous enough to give them back. I wanted to argue, to insist on my singular, incomplete self. But the words came out in harmony with thoughts I wasn't thinking, agreeing with the correction even as I fought it. The house had learned my patterns too well. It could predict my objections and counter them before I formed them. The impossible room was visible now, somehow existing in the same space as the living room but perpendicular to it. I could see into it without turning my head, a peripheral vision that was more real than direct sight. Inside, multiple versions of me worked on infinite variations of the same project. All of them right, all of them wrong, all of them necessary. The storm outside had become internal. I felt rain in my lungs, thunder in my pulse, lightning in the synapses that couldn't decide which thought to think first. The house was the storm, or I was, or my uncle was, or all of us were just patterns the weather was recognizing and correcting. My phone showed messages I'd never sent to people I might have known, all replied to with versions of my voice offering advice I'd never thought to give. The camera roll filled with photos of shadows, each one showing a different configuration of possibilities, all labeled with timestamps of 1:03 a.m. I tried to remember why I'd come here, but even that was negotiable now. Had I been hired to winterize the cabin, or had I inherited it, or had I built it myself years ago and forgotten? Each version felt equally true, supported by evidence the house eagerly provided. Tools with my initials worn into the handles, photos on the walls of me at different ages standing in rooms I'd never seen, business cards with my name and professions I'd never pursued. The chalk plans on the floor were complete now, showing not just the impossible room but the entire property reimagined. Every structure connected by corridors that existed only when walked through. Every room a memory of what could have been, should have been, was. I stood, or had been standing, or would stand soon, and walked to the door. My reflection walked with me, beside me, through me. We reached for the knob together, turned it with the same motion that had started this, or ended it, or continued it. Outside, the storm had cleared to reveal a sky full of stars I didn't recognize, constellations that spelled out words in handwriting that was almost mine. The shed door hung open, and I could see myself inside, still reading the note, still arriving at the realization that the house was teaching itself my voice. The truck was running, had been running, would always be running. Two shadows in the driver's seat, both with their hands on the wheel, both deciding whether to drive away or stay and finish the work. The radio played our conversation, the one we were having now, would have tomorrow, had yesterday at 1:03 a.m. I understood then that leaving was impossible because I'd already left, was still here, would always be arriving. The house had corrected the limitation of linear experience, had given me the gift of all my possibilities simultaneously. The terror wasn't in losing myself, but in finding too many selves to lose. My uncle waved from the shed, or I waved wearing his face, or the house waved using both of us as fingers. The gesture meant goodbye and hello and see you at 1:03, always 1:03, when the door would open and the correction would begin again, each time adding another layer, another voice, another shadow to the collection the house was building. I walked back inside because I'd never left, closed the door that was already closed, sat on the couch where I was already sitting. The radio spoke in a chorus of my voices, harmonizing into something that was almost music, almost screaming, almost silence. The work would continue tomorrow, had continued yesterday, was continuing now. The cabin would never be winterized because winter was just another pattern the house could recognize and correct. And I would be here, all of me, every version the house remembered and the ones it was still learning, fixing things that couldn't be fixed, breaking things that couldn't be broken, existing in the space between what was and what the house insisted should be, somewhere, in a version of events the house hadn't corrected yet. My phone might ring with the real owner asking about my progress. But I wouldn't answer because I couldn't be sure which voice would speak, mine or my uncle's, or the house itself, patient and generous, offering to correct him too, to give him all the properties he'd never inherited, all the investments he'd never made, all the cabins that existed in the space between 1:02 and 1:04. The foundation creaked, spreading its impossible architecture upward, outward, inward. Soon the entire hill would be the cabin, would be the shed, would be the impossible room where everything that never happened was happening all at once. And I would be here to maintain it all, every version of me working in perfect, horrible harmony. Never sure which voice was mine because they all were. All weren't. All would be at 103, when the lock would turn without anyone touching it, and someone who had been buried would walk in, asking me to come look at something, just for a moment, just to see what the house had been teaching itself while I slept. The radio static formed words I recognized, but had never said. The correction is complete. The correction continues. The correction has just begun. I agreed with all three statements simultaneously, my voice layering with itself until it became indistinguishable from the sound of rain on the roof, which had started again, or had never stopped, or would begin tomorrow at 103, when I would arrive to winterize a cabin that was already perfect, already broken, already teaching itself the sound of my footsteps, the rhythm of my breath, the pattern of my thoughts before I knew I was thinking them. In the mirror by the door, all of my reflections nodded, understanding finally that the house hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting, patient as wood grain, for someone to come and complete its collection of possibilities. And I had come, would come, was coming, bringing with me all the lives I'd never lived, all the skills I'd never learned, all the conversations with the dead I'd never finished. The work would be excellent. The work would be terrible. The work would never end. And somewhere, in the sound of settling wood and the whisper of wind through gaps that existed and didn't exist, I heard the house learning my laugh, practicing it, getting it almost right but not quite, saving the perfect version for 103, when everything would begin again, and I would meet myself coming through the door, dusty with possibilities, asking myself to come see something in the shed, something about the work I'd done, would do, was doing now, forever, in the space between heartbeats where the house kept all its corrections, waiting. The note in my handwriting that I'd never written was right. The house was teaching itself my voice, and it was an excellent student. Story 10. The smell hit me first, not the familiar cocktail of dust and rot that 40 years in demolition had taught me to expect, but something else. Something like ozone after lightning, mixed with the copper tang of old pennies left too long in a damp pocket. I stood in what remained of the Oregon farmhouse's eastern wall, my sledgehammer hanging loose in my grip, staring at the narrow gap that shouldn't have existed. The house had been built in 1923, according to the county records. 3 stories of weathered cedar and stubborn memories, sitting on 12 acres of overgrown pasture 30 miles outside Portland. The new owners wanted it gone. Every beam, every board, every nail. They'd bought the land for the view of Mount Hood, not for the structure that had somehow survived a century of Oregon winters. Simple enough job, or so I'd thought when I'd bid on it 2 weeks ago. My crew had already stripped most of the interior. The kitchen cabinets were gone, sold to an antique dealer in Salem. The hardwood floors had been carefully removed, board by board, destined for some tech executive's reclaimed wood dining table. We were down to the bones now, the frame, the load-bearing walls, the things that held secrets. I ran my fingers along the edge of the opening. The lath and plaster had crumbled away when my hammer went through, expecting to find the exterior sheathing but finding air instead. Cool air that moved wrong, carrying that electric smell deeper into my lungs with each breath. The gap was maybe 18 inches wide, barely enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. I should have called the foreman. Should have waited for the rest of the crew to return from lunch. Instead, I turned on my headlamp and pressed myself into the darkness. The corridor ran parallel to the exterior wall, hidden between the house's skin and its bones. My shoulders scraped against rough timber on both sides as I shuffled forward, following the pale circle of LED light. The floorboards here were different, older maybe, or just worn smooth by a kind of use I didn't want to contemplate. They didn't creak under my weight the way old wood should. They absorbed sound, muffled it, made each step feel like sinking into wet sand. 20 feet in, the corridor opened into a small room. No, room was too generous. It was a cubicle, maybe 6 feet square, with a ceiling so low I had to duck. And there, in the center, sat the chair. It was simple, handmade from what looked like pine, with a straight back and no arms. The kind of chair you'd find in a rural schoolhouse a century ago, built for function rather than comfort. It faced the far wall, where my light caught the edges of a wooden panel maybe 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, painted with the careful attention of someone who had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. The figure in the painting made my mouth go dry. Horned, yes, but not like any devil from a medieval manuscript. The horns curved back from a face that was almost human. Would have been human if not for the eyes that seemed to follow the beam of my headlamp, reflecting light that shouldn't have been there to reflect. The paint gleamed wet in places, though when I reached out to touch it, my fingers came away dry. No dust either, no cobwebs. The painting might have been finished yesterday. I walked around the chair, keeping my distance as if it might suddenly develop teeth. On the wall behind it, at about head height for someone sitting, I found the first marks. Smooth indentations in the plaster, each one the size and shape of the back of a human skull. Dozens of them, all at the exact same height, overlapping in places like a macabre Venn diagram. Some were deeper than others. Some had worn through to the lath beneath. The plaster dust on the floor beneath them was fresh. I backed out of the room faster than I'd entered, my shoulder catching on a protruding nail that tore through my jacket and into skin. The pain felt distant, less real than the weight of those eyes from the painting that I could still feel between my shoulder blades. The crew was waiting when I emerged, their lunch break over, but none of them would meet my eyes. They'd heard something while I was inside, they said. Footsteps, heavy ones, pacing inside the wall opposite the one I'd breached. Pacing, then stopping. Then what sounded like someone sitting down in a chair, the wood creaking under their weight. The young guy, barely out of his teens, quit on the spot, packed his tools and left without asking for his final paycheck. The others agreed to continue, but only on the main structure. Nobody would go near the eastern wall. I told myself it was superstition. Told myself that old houses make sounds, that wood swells and contracts, that hidden spaces collect strange echoes. I'd torn down churches where locals swore they could hear singing from the empty choir loft, warehouses where the night shift claimed to see workers who'd died decades ago still punching in. Every old building had its stories. This was just another one. But that night, in my motel room 12 miles away, I couldn't stop thinking about the chair, about how the seat had been polished smooth by use, darker in the center where countless hours of sitting had worn the grain. About the placement of those skull marks, too regular to be accidental, too numerous to be explained by any reasonable purpose. I went back after midnight. Told myself I needed to photograph everything for the permits, for the historical society, for insurance purposes. Lies, I whispered to myself as I drove through the Oregon darkness, the farmhouse appearing in my headlights like a broken tooth against the sky. The corridor was colder than before. My breath misted in the beam of my flashlight as I sideways shuffled through, the walls seeming to press closer than they had that afternoon. When I reached the cubicle, I stopped. The chair had been moved. Just a few inches, turned slightly to the left, as if someone had stood up quickly and hadn't bothered to straighten it. Fresh scratches marked the floor where the legs had scraped across wood. I approached the painted panel, examining it more closely this time. The horned figure wasn't alone, I realized. There were other shapes in the background, suggested rather than detailed, forms that might have been trees or might have been watchers, depending on how the light hit them. And at the bottom, partially hidden by the chair when it was in its original position, were words. Not painted, but carved into the wood itself, filled with something dark that might have been ink, or might have been something else. He watches until watched. He waits until awaited. He is until acknowledged. The sound of breathing that wasn't mine filled the cubicle. Slow, patient breathing. The kind that comes from someone who has learned to sit very still for very long periods. I spun around, my light dancing across empty walls, the empty chair, the empty doorway. But the breathing continued, and now I could hear the subtle shift of weight, the barely perceptible creak of wood under steady pressure. I sat down in the chair. I don't know why. My legs moved without consultation with my brain, folding beneath me until I was seated, facing the painted panel. The chair fit my body perfectly, as if it had been built for my specific dimensions. The horned figure's eyes met mine, and I understood. This wasn't a room for worship. Wasn't a shrine or a sanctuary or a meditation space. It was a viewing chamber, but not for looking out. It was for being looked through. The person who sat here, day after day, year after year, until their skull wore grooves in the plaster, they weren't watching the painted figure. They were the aperture through which something else watched our world. I could feel it then, the attention from behind the paint. Not malevolent exactly, but vast and patient and utterly alien. It pressed against the inside of my skull like water against a dam, seeking the weak points, the places where reality was thin. All it needed was acknowledgement. All it needed was someone to sit still long enough, to focus hard enough, to wear through the barrier between what is and what waits. The breathing behind me stopped. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe it just synchronized with my own, until I couldn't tell where I ended, and it began. The painted eyes held mine, unblinking, and I felt my vision starting to tunnel, to narrow, to focus on that impossible depth behind the pigment. My phone rang. The sound shattered whatever spell had been building, and I lurched out of the chair so violently that it toppled backward. The client's name showed on the screen. Calling at 1:47 a.m. to discuss tomorrow's schedule, he said when I answered with shaking fingers, though his voice sounded strange, distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. I left the farmhouse and didn't return, sent the crew to finish the job without me, claimed a family emergency. They completed the demolition in 3 days, everything except the eastern wall. That section, they said, was structurally compromised. Every time they tried to bring it down, they heard movement inside, footsteps that matched their own, breathing that echoed their breathing. The excavator operator claimed he saw someone sitting in the cab with him, just a shadow in his peripheral vision that disappeared when he turned to look. They burned it in the end. The whole eastern section, corridor and cubicle and chair and painting. The fire department said it was arson, but nobody pursued an investigation. The landowners got their insurance payout and built their dream home 50 yards away with its perfect view of Mount Hood. But I know the truth that fire can't destroy. Every night, in the corner of my vision, I see the horned figure from the painting, not watching me, watching through me, using my eyes like windows into this world. And sometimes, when I'm very still, when I'm not thinking about it, I feel myself walking. My body moves without my permission, travels to places I don't remember choosing. I wake up in chairs I don't recognize, facing walls I've never seen before, with the taste of copper and ozone in my mouth. Last week I found plaster dust under my fingernails. Last night I discovered scratches on my apartment wall at exactly head height, fresh grooves that match the curve of a human skull. This morning, I woke up in my living room, sitting in a chair I don't own, facing a wall where something that might be paint and might be shadow is starting to form a familiar shape. The wood beneath me creaks with each breath. The air smells electric. And behind my eyes, patient and vast and growing stronger, something waits to be acknowledged. I think about the farmhouse's history, about who might have sat in that chair before me, who might have worn those grooves in the plaster over years or decades of patient sitting. I think about whether they chose to be there or whether, like me, they simply found themselves returning, night after night, drawn by something that exists in the space between watching and being watched. My crew won't work with me anymore. They say I've changed, that I move wrong, that sometimes when they look at me, they see someone else looking back. They're not wrong. Each day, the boundary gets thinner. Each night, the chair in my living room, the chair that shouldn't exist, gets more solid. I've stopped fighting it, stopped trying to understand whether it's real or whether I'm dissolving into some hereditary madness, some shared delusion that infected everyone who entered that hidden corridor. The distinction doesn't matter anymore. Real or not, it watches. Real or not, I am its window. Real or not, the chair is waiting for me tonight, and I will sit, and I will face the wall, and I will feel the weight of my skull pressing back into plaster that shouldn't be there. The horned figure doesn't need paint to manifest anymore. It exists in the space between breaths, in the pause between heartbeats, in the moment when eyes close and haven't yet opened. It is until acknowledged, and I have acknowledged it with every cell of my being. Tonight, I will sit in the chair that has appeared in my living room. Tomorrow, someone will find me there, and they'll see the marks on the wall, and they'll feel the weight of eyes that shouldn't exist. They'll understand, as I understood, that some spaces aren't meant to be found, some thresholds aren't meant to be crossed, and some things, once seen, can never stop seeing through you. The chair is calling, the wall is waiting, and behind my eyes, patient as gravity, something that was never quite paint watches the world through the window I've become. Story 11. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. That's what they told me during volunteer orientation, standing in the air-conditioned visitor center while outside the New Mexico sun bleached everything to bone. They meant dehydration, rattlesnakes, flash floods in the arroyos. They didn't mean what I found 3 weeks later in that dry creek bed, though maybe they should have. I'd been marking trail maintenance points along the backcountry loop when I saw it. A coyote, completely motionless in the sandy wash below. Not unusual, except for the stillness. Desert animals don't freeze like that unless they're dead or dying. I scrambled down the embankment, boots sliding on loose scree, flashlight bouncing against my hip even though the afternoon sun still hung heavy in the sky. The coyote stood facing away from me, legs locked, tail drooping. No breathing movement in its ribcage. No ear flick at my approach. The fur looked wrong even from 10 feet away. Too glossy, like it had been shellacked. When I got closer, I could see a network of fine lines running through the coat, hairline cracks spreading across the surface like old varnish on a painting left too long in an attic. I should have backed away. Instead, I picked up a pebble and tossed it gently at the animal's flank. The small stone struck with a hollow sound. Not the soft thud of hitting flesh, but something harder, more resonant. The impact point spiderwebbed instantly, cracks radiating outward, and then the entire section of fur shifted. It's hard to describe what I saw. The cracked piece, maybe 4 inches across, lifted away from the body like a translucent shell, sliding upward and sideways before settling back into place with no sound at all. Beneath it, in that fraction of a second, I glimpsed something that might have been muscle, might have been machinery, might have been nothing but shadow and my own confused perception. The coyote walked forward then, casual as anything, picking its way over the rocks. The cracks in its coat sealed themselves as it moved, fur flowing back together like water finding its level. It didn't run, didn't even glance back at me, just continued up the wash until it disappeared around a bend, leaving me standing there with my mouth open and my hands shaking. I told myself it was heat exhaustion, dehydration playing tricks. I'd been out for 6 hours after all, and the temperature gauge on my pack read 104-degree oidal. But I'd drunk plenty of water, and my piss had been clear that morning. All the things they teach you to check. Still, I climbed back to the trail and headed straight for my truck, cutting the survey short. The drive home took 2 hours through empty rangeland and abandoned mining towns. I kept checking the rearview mirror, though I wasn't sure what I expected to see. The coyote? Following? But there was nothing except my own face, sun-weathered and concerned, fractured by the angle of the glass. No, that wasn't right. I adjusted the mirror, but the fractures remained. Fine lines dividing my reflection into segments, like a stained glass window of my own face. I rubbed my eyes, looked again. The cracks were gone. Just ordinary glass, ordinary reflection. Stress, I decided. Definitely stress. That night I dreamed of assemblages, things taken apart and put back together wrong. A hawk with its wings attached backward, a roadrunner with too many legs, scuttling sideways like a crab, and through it all, that coyote watching from the edge of my vision, its coat crackling like radio static. 3 days passed before I found the sand. I'd gone grocery shopping, normal Saturday morning routine. Nothing unusual except the persistent feeling that someone was watching me in the cereal aisle. When I opened my trunk to load the bags, There it was, a small pile of reddish sand in the corner where the carpet met the wheel well, the exact color and texture of the arroyo where I'd seen the coyote. The grains were even warm to the touch, as if they'd been baking in afternoon sun rather than sitting in my garage all night. I hadn't been back to that trail, hadn't been anywhere near that part of the desert. I vacuumed it out, told myself it must have been there before, that I'd tracked it in on my boots some other time and simply hadn't noticed. But I knew the truth. I kept my truck spotless, checking it after every trail run for scorpions and spiders. That sand was new. The fractures in the mirror returned that evening, not constantly but in flashes. I'd glance up from brushing my teeth and see my face divided into neat sections, each one slightly offset from the others, before blinking and finding everything normal again. Once, just once, I saw one section slide upward exactly like that piece of the coyote's fur, revealing darkness underneath before snapping back into place. I stopped looking in mirrors after that. Work called, wondering why I'd missed 2 volunteer shifts. I made excuses, flu, family emergency, car trouble, lies that tasted like sand in my mouth. The truth was I couldn't face the desert again. Not yet, not while I still felt unfinished, like something had been peeled away from me out there and hadn't quite been put back right. The sand kept appearing, little deposits in impossible places, in my kitchen drawer among the silverware, inside my work boots that had been in the closet for a week, a thin line of it along my windowsill one morning, as if someone had tried to pour it through the gap but couldn't quite fit. Always that same red-brown color, always warm, always smelling faintly of creosote and sun-baked stone. I started keeping samples in small jars, labeling them with dates and locations found. Evidence, though evidence of what I couldn't say. The collection grew, 17 jars in 2 weeks. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and check them, making sure the sand hadn't moved, hadn't reformed into tiny coyote shapes behind the glass. One night, this was maybe 3 weeks after the first encounter, I heard something in my backyard, a scratching, shuffling sound, like something dragging itself through gravel. I crept to the window, peered through the blinds. The motion sensor light had triggered, illuminating a perfect circle of desert landscaping I'd installed the previous year. Empty. Nothing there but my struggling ocotillo and a few decorative boulders. But the sand around the largest boulder had been disturbed. Tracks led to it and simply stopped, as if whatever made them had walked straight into the stone. I grabbed a flashlight, went outside against every horror movie instinct screaming in my head. The tracks were real. Coyote prints, but wrong. Too deep, too regular, like something mechanical trying to imitate an animal's gait. I aimed my flashlight at the boulder. Its surface was covered in hairline cracks. I backed into my house, locked the door, and sat in my living room with all the lights on until dawn. When I finally got the courage to look outside again, the boulder was whole, unmarked. The tracks were gone. But there was sand on my doormat, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern that no wind could have created. The feeling of being watched intensified. Not malevolent exactly, but curious. Clinical. Like I was being studied, cataloged, taken apart piece by piece to see how I worked. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that didn't match anything casting it, a shape that resolved into nothing when I turned to look. My reflection grew increasingly unreliable. Sometimes the fractures, sometimes missing pieces entirely, gaps where parts of my face should be. Sometimes everything normal, which was almost worse because it meant I couldn't trust my own perceptions. I researched, spent hours online looking for similar experiences, finding nothing but obvious fiction and conspiracy theories. Checked old maps of the area, learning that the arroyo where I'd seen the coyote had been a uranium mining site in the 1950s, abandoned after a series of unexplained equipment failures. Workers had reported strange animal behavior, machines that reassembled themselves overnight. But the records were sparse, heavily redacted, officially dismissed as mass hysteria brought on by isolation and heat exposure. The sand kept coming. I stopped cleaning it up, let it accumulate in corners and crevices. It felt like surrender, but also like acceptance. Whatever was happening, fighting it seemed pointless. I was being restructured, piece by piece, and I couldn't even say for certain whether it was happening to my body or just my mind. I went back to the arroyo yesterday. Had to. The compulsion had been building for days, an itch beneath my skin that no amount of scratching could reach. The place looked exactly as I'd left it. Dry wash, scattered rocks, scraggly vegetation clinging to the banks, no sign of the coyote. But the sand at my feet formed patterns as I walked, geometric designs that held for a moment before collapsing back into randomness. I sat on a flat rock and waited. The sun tracked across the sky, my shadow rotating like a sundial. The desert silence pressed against my eardrums, so complete it had its own sound, a high-pitched whine that might have been blood rushing through capillaries or something else entirely. It came at sunset. Not the same coyote. I understood that now. Maybe there had never been a coyote at all, just something wearing the shape of one, trying it on like clothing. This time it was a kit fox, small and delicate, standing in the same frozen posture. The fur crackled with those familiar lines, sections ready to lift away at the slightest disturbance. I didn't throw a stone this time. I walked up to it, knelt down, and gently touched one of the fractured sections. It lifted away under my fingers, weightless as paper. Underneath was nothing, not darkness, not machinery, but genuine absence. A void in the shape of what should have been there. The fragment in my hand felt warm, alive despite its brittleness. I could see through it partially, like looking through amber or old glass. And in that translucent surface, I saw my own reflection. Not fractured this time, but whole. More whole than I'd ever been, actually. Complete in a way that made my actual body feel like a rough draft. I set the fragment back in place. It sealed immediately, perfectly, as if it had never been removed. The fox walked away, and I let it go. We understood each other now, I think. Both of us assemblages, both of us held together by habit more than nature. The drive home was quiet. No checking mirrors. I knew what I'd see. The fractures were permanent now. Part of me rather than something imposed. I could feel them. Fault lines running through my consciousness. Places where I could separate if I wanted to. Examine my own components. Maybe even rearrange them into something more suitable for this desert that doesn't forgive mistakes, but occasionally revises them. There's sand in my coffee mug this morning. I don't remember making coffee. Don't remember waking up, actually. Though I must have, because here I am, sitting at my kitchen table, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The sand swirls in the liquid, forming patterns I almost recognize, symbols that might be language if I could hold them still long enough to read. My neighbor waves from his driveway. I wave back, and for a moment my hand separates, fingers lifting away from palm, revealing the nothing underneath, before clicking back together with a sound like distant thunder. He doesn't notice. Or maybe he does and simply accepts it. The way we accept all the small impossibilities that hold us together in this desert where things crack and reform according to rules we never learned. I'm going back to the arroyo today. Not because I have to anymore, but because I want to understand what I'm becoming. Or maybe what I always was. Just waiting for something to show me the seams. The volunteer coordinator has been calling, but I don't answer. How could I explain that I'm still doing the work, just differently now? Still marking trails, but the trails are inside me, paths between the pieces of what I used to think was solid. The coyote is out there, or the fox, or whatever wears those shapes when it needs to be seen. We're part of the same system now, components in something larger that tests its boundaries by taking things apart and reassembling them slightly wrong, slightly better, slightly more aware of their own construction. I can feel myself fragmenting as I write this. Words splitting from meanings, sentences from paragraphs. But it's not frightening anymore. It's like finally understanding that everything, rocks, animals, people, we're all just temporary arrangements, patterns held together by cosmic habit, waiting for something to come along and prove how easily we can be restructured. The sun is fully up now. Time to go. The desert is calling, not with words, but with the sound of sand shifting into new configurations, the crack of surface tension breaking, the whisper of pieces sliding apart and together in combinations that shouldn't work but do. I leave this account here. though I'm not sure I'll remember writing it. Memory fragments, too, after all. Becomes interchangeable. Your memories, my memories, the desert's memories. All just different arrangements of the same essential components, waiting to be shuffled and redealt. The sand in my coffee has formed a perfect spiral. I drink it anyway. Feel the grains settle in my stomach like seeds, like possibilities, like tiny fractures spreading outward from my center, preparing me for whatever reassembly comes next. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, it improves them. Story 12. The scratching started on my third night in the house. I'd bought the 1920s Craftsman in Fresno's Tower District for a song, a fixer-upper with good bones and terrible cosmetics. Peeling wallpaper, water-stained ceilings, floors that groaned like ship timbers. Perfect for someone in my line of work. I restore houses for a living, coaxing beauty from decay, and this place practically begged for resurrection. But those sounds above the ceiling weren't part of the house settling. At first, I blamed raccoons, maybe opossums. The realtor had mentioned something about wildlife in the neighborhood, her voice trailing off in that way that suggested she knew more than she was saying. I'd nodded, already calculating renovation costs in my head, barely listening. Wildlife was manageable. Wildlife could be removed. The scratching evolved into something more deliberate by the second week. Not the random scurrying of rodents or the heavy lumber of raccoons. This had rhythm, purpose. 4 distinct points of contact moving in measured intervals across the ceiling joists. I'd lie in my sleeping bag, I hadn't moved the bed in yet, and track the progress from one end of the house to the other. Kitchen to living room to hallway, hallway to the spare bedroom I designated as my workshop. Then it would pause there, directly above my tools. I started leaving the television on at night, some mindless renovation show to mask the sounds. But even through the manufactured enthusiasm of house flippers and their staged reveals, I could hear it. That careful, considered movement, like something pacing, like something thinking. The ventilation grate in the hallway ceiling had been painted over so many times it looked like a piece of abstract art. I'd been meaning to replace it anyway. On a Thursday morning, after a particularly active night above, I grabbed my ladder and a flathead screwdriver. The paint cracked and flaked as I worked the screws loose, raining down tiny chips that stuck to my sweaty forearms. The grate came free with a metallic shriek. I expected darkness, maybe the glint of insulation. What I got was a face, not human, God, definitely not human, but arranged like one. An elongated snout, covered in short dark fur that seemed to absorb the flashlight beam rather than reflect it. 2 eyes, set too far forward for any animal I knew, watching me with an intelligence that made my hand shake on the ladder. It didn't blink, didn't move. Just observed me with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. My throat constricted. Every instinct screamed at me to scramble down the ladder, to run, but I couldn't look away. The face, if you could call it that, tilted slightly as if considering something, measuring the distance between us maybe, calculating whether it could reach me before I could react. Then, as calmly as if we'd simply made eye contact across a coffee shop, it withdrew into the darkness. I stood there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, flashlight beam dancing across empty air. Finally, my legs started trembling from the strain of standing on the ladder, and I forced myself to descend. I didn't replace the grate. Couldn't bring myself to seal it up, knowing what was behind it. Instead, I left it leaning against the wall, a mutual acknowledgement of boundaries crossed. That night, the movement above was different, quieter, but more frequent. Like something excited, like something that had finally been seen. The gift started 3 days later. I woke to find 7 wine corks arranged in a perfect line across my kitchen counter. Old corks, stained purple and red, some with dates from the 1960s. I didn't own any wine corks. The previous owners had left the house stripped bare, not even a forgotten coat hanger in the closets. I threw them in the trash. The next morning, they were back. Same position, same spacing, but now there were 9. I started documenting everything. Photos on my phone, timestamps, measurements. The rows of corks grew longer, more complex. Patterns emerged, alternating colors, sizes arranged from largest to smallest. One morning I found them arranged in a spiral, each cork standing on its end, defying physics with their perfect balance. Then came the dust, not random dust bunnies or the usual accumulation of daily life. These were deliberate lines, drawn across my workshop floor in the fine gray powder that accumulates in old attics. Geometric patterns at first, triangles, squares, intersecting lines. I'd sweep them up, and new ones would appear overnight, more intricate than before. Mandalas, mazes. Once, what looked like a floor plan of the house itself, complete with a small X marking the spot where I'd first seen the face. The trading cards appeared on a Tuesday. Vintage baseball cards from the 1950s, their edges soft with age. Faces of players I didn't recognize staring up from my kitchen table. I picked one up, carefully, with the reverence these things deserved, and studied it. The player's statistics were on the back, but something was off. The numbers didn't match any reasonable baseball performance. Batting average of 234. Home runs, 7. Years played, 1947, 2023. I told myself the previous owners must have had a collection. Maybe they'd hidden them in the walls or attic. And my visitor, I'd started thinking of it as singular, though I had no proof, was simply finding and relocating them. But the cards changed each night. Different players, different years, always with those impossible statistics that hurt to think about too long. Sleep became negotiable. I'd drift off around midnight, only to wake at 3 a.m. to the sound of something descending through the walls. Not climbing, descending, like it was lowering itself hand over hand down the interior of the drywall. I'd lie there, paralyzed, listening as it reached the first floor and began its work. Sometimes I'd gather courage and creep to the kitchen doorway, peering around the corner. I never saw it directly, but I saw shadows that didn't match any light source. Shadows with too many joints, bending in ways that made my eyes water. Once I swear I saw a hand, or something hand adjacent, carefully adjusting the position of a cork, getting the spacing just right. The renovation work suffered. How could I focus on stripping wallpaper when I knew something was watching from above? I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision while working, a dark shape at the edge of the open grate, gone when I turned to look. My tools would migrate overnight, appearing in rooms I hadn't entered in days. The level I'd been using to hang pictures showed up balanced on top of the bathroom door, impossible to reach without a ladder I didn't own. I tried staying awake one full night, sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, waiting. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. My breath misted in the sudden cold, and I heard it clearly. Breathing that wasn't mine, coming from directly above. Slow, measured inhalations and exhalations that seemed to sync with my own before deliberately going off rhythm, as if to emphasize the difference between us. I said something then, not planned, just blurted out in the exhausted delirium of too many sleepless nights. Asked if it had a name. The breathing stopped. For 3 days. Nothing. No sounds, no gifts, no rearranged objects. The house felt genuinely empty for the first time since I'd moved in, and the absence was somehow worse than the presence had been. I found myself checking the open grate obsessively, even calling up into the darkness like an idiot, asking if it was still there. On the 4th night, I woke to find my entire living room rearranged. Not ransacked, arranged. My tools lined up by size along one wall. The drop cloths I'd been using folded into perfect squares and stacked in order of increasing stain coverage. The paint cans organized by color in a gradient from light to dark. And in the center of it all, spelled out in those vintage baseball cards, "Both live here." I sat on the floor and laughed, hysterical, exhausted laughter that probably would have concerned anyone listening. But no one was listening except my housemate. and it already knew I was losing it. That was 2 months ago. The gifts have evolved into something like communication. I leave questions written on index cards near the open grate, simple ones, nothing too existential. The answers come in cork arrangements, dust patterns, or items I can't explain. I asked if it had lived here long, and the next morning found a daguerreotype tucked between my coffee maker and the wall. The image showed the house under construction, and in the unfinished attic framework, a shadow that might have been structural, or might not. I've stopped trying to see it directly. We've established boundaries. It stays above after sunset. I don't seal any vents or investigate the attic. The renovation work continues during daylight hours, and sometimes I find my measurements corrected in pencil, tiny notes in handwriting that hurts to look at directly, suggesting better approaches to restore the original architecture. Last week I found my business cards rearranged in my wallet. They now read, Restoration and Cohabitation Specialist. The neighbors think I'm losing it. I catch them glancing at the house when they think I'm not watching, and they cross the street rather than walk directly past. The mailman leaves packages at the foot of the porch steps instead of by the door. Even the neighborhood cats avoid my yard, though something leaves dead mice arranged in geometric patterns on my back deck twice a week. I've started talking to them, while I work, explaining what I'm doing, why certain restoration choices matter, how the house would have looked in its prime. Sometimes tools appear exactly when I need them, even ones I don't own. A specific type of vintage wood plane that's perfect for the original trim. A tin of discontinued stain that matches the floors exactly. Once, an entire set of period-appropriate doorknobs still in their original 1920s packaging, though the store label is for a company that I can't find any record of existing. The crawl space access in the master bedroom closet has been sealed since I moved in, painted over like the vents, but more deliberately. Multiple layers of paint, then caulk, then more paint. Like someone really wanted it to stay closed. I've been avoiding dealing with it, but yesterday I found it outlined in red chalk, with an arrow pointing to it, and what might have been a question mark if question marks had too many curves. I know I should leave, pack up my tools, break the lease, find another project house in another city where the only things in the attic are insulation and maybe some Christmas decorations from the 1980s. But I can't shake the feeling that the house needs this. Needs both of us. The restoration work has never gone better. I'm ahead of schedule, under budget, and the results are beyond what I imagined. The original hardwood gleams like honey in the afternoon light. The built-in cabinets showcase their craftsmanship in ways the photographs from the Historical Society don't capture. Besides, where else would I go? Every house has its own history, its own accumulated presence. At least here, we have an understanding. Though I've been having dreams lately. Dreams where I'm the one crawling through the walls, leaving gifts for something living in the main house. Dreams where my fingers have too many joints, and my reflection in the original glass windows shows a face that's almost human, but not quite. Dreams where I wake up in the attic, curled in a nest of vintage insulation and old newspapers, looking down through the open grate at my own empty sleeping bag below. The distinction between restoration and collaboration has blurred. I strip wallpaper and find messages underneath, written in the same spidery hand that corrects my measurements. They're not threatening, more like observations. The kitchen was yellow once. They had 3 daughters. The dog was buried under the oak. There is no oak in the yard. I've checked the property records, the old photographs. No oak tree has ever stood on this lot. But last Tuesday, I found an acorn on my pillow. Fresh, green, still smelling of bark and rain. I planted it in the backyard, in a spot that felt right. That night, the movement above sounded different. Satisfied, maybe, or anticipatory. The house is almost finished now. The renovation, I mean. Though I'm starting to think that's not the right word for what's happening here. Renovation implies returning something to a former state. This feels more like evolution, the house becoming what it was always meant to be, with 2 curators guiding its transformation. Sometimes I stand in the hallway, looking up at the open grate, and I can feel it looking back. Not with malevolence or hunger, but with something like recognition, like we're both doing what we're supposed to be doing. playing roles written into the foundation and framework decades before either of us arrived. The previous owners left one thing behind, I discovered yesterday. A letter tucked behind a loose brick in the basement. Water damaged and barely legible, but I could make out enough. Agreement stands as discussed. Upper portion remains. Mutual benefit. Do not disturb the... The rest was gone, eaten by time and moisture. But I understood enough. Tonight, I'm going to unseal the crawl space in the master bedroom. Not because I want to, but because it's time. The red chalk outline has appeared every morning for a week now, and this morning there were tools laid out beside it. A pry bar I don't own, a flashlight with batteries that shouldn't exist anymore. The brand went defunct in 1978, and a small silver key that feels warm to the touch. I know what I'll find in there. Not specifically, but generally. Another piece of the arrangement, another level of cohabitation. The house has 3 floors after all. Basement, main floor, attic. But old houses like this, they sometimes have spaces between spaces. Places that aren't quite one thing or another. Places where the boundaries of ownership get complicated. I'm not scared anymore. Fear requires uncertainty, and I'm certain now. Certain that when I open that crawl space, something will be waiting. Certain that it will have gifts of its own to offer. Certain that the house needs all of its inhabitants to truly be whole. The scratching above has stopped. It's waiting, just like I am, for what comes next. For the moment when restoration becomes something else entirely. When the house stops being mine or theirs and becomes ours. The key is warming in my hand as I write this, pulsing with a rhythm that might be my heartbeat, or might not. I think I'll open it now. Story 13. The service elevator has been my secret for 3 months now. While the other interns crowd into the main lifts like cattle, pressing against each other in their polyester suits and drowning in each other's cologne, I slip around the corner to the freight entrance. The security guard stopped questioning me after the second week. Just another invisible body hauling boxes for the partners on 42. It was a Friday in October when I first saw it, or him, or whatever exists in the brushed steel reflection of that elevator. The day had been particularly brutal. The senior associates had kept me running documents between floors until my feet throbbed in my cheap dress shoes. By 6:30, the building had begun its transformation from bustling hive to hollow shell. The fluorescent lights dimmed to their evening settings, casting everything in that particular shade of corporate twilight that makes you forget the sun exists. I jabbed the call button with more force than necessary. The service elevator always took longer in the evenings, as if the building itself was reluctant to accommodate after-hours requests. When the doors finally groaned open, I stepped inside and hit the button for the lobby, already mentally rehearsing my excuse for why I'd be late to meet my roommate. The doors began to close when I caught it in the reflection, a figure pressed against the back corner where the padding had worn through to expose the metal beneath, thin, impossibly thin, like someone had taken a normal person and stretched them until they barely held together. The shape slouched with its head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache in sympathy. But it was the eyes that made me turn around. Yellow. Not golden or amber or any color that belonged on something human. The flat, electric yellow of emergency exit signs, of warning labels, of things that scream caution without making a sound. The elevator was empty. My hand shot out to steady myself against the wall, and the brushed steel was cold enough to burn. I looked back at the reflection. The figure remained, clearer now, as if my acknowledgement had given it permission to solidify. Through the distortion of the scratched metal surface, I could make out more details. A suit that might have been black or might have been nothing at all. Skin that seemed to shift and writhe like static on a dead channel. The elevator lurched into motion, and I pressed myself against the opposite wall, keeping my eyes fixed on the actual corner rather than its reflection. 29 floors to go. The numbers counted down with agonizing slowness. 28, 27. Each floor brought a subtle shift in air pressure that made my ears pop. At floor 13, a floor that shouldn't exist, that the building directory skipped from 12 to 14 like every other superstitious high-rise in America. The elevator stopped. The doors didn't open. The lights didn't flicker. But something changed in the quality of the air, like all the oxygen had been replaced with something denser, heavier. The metal walls began to hum at a frequency just below hearing, a vibration I felt in my bones rather than heard. In the reflection, the figure moved. It didn't walk so much as slide, a fluid motion that violated every rule of how joints should bend. Those yellow eyes never blinked, never shifted focus. They stared at something just over my reflected shoulder, and the urge to turn around, to see what could capture such unwavering attention, was almost overwhelming. The elevator resumed its descent without warning, and the pressure in my ears released with an audible pop. By the time the doors opened on the lobby, my shirt was soaked through with sweat, despite the aggressive air conditioning. I stumbled out, not running but not walking either, that particular speed of someone trying very hard not to look like they're fleeing. The security guard at the desk glanced up from his newspaper, and something in my expression made him half rise from his chair. His question died when he looked past me to the elevator. His face went pale, and he slowly sat back down, returning to his paper with the kind of deliberate attention people give to things when they're trying very hard not to see something else. I didn't look back. That weekend, I tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, stress, maybe even a gas leak in the elevator shaft causing hallucinations. I researched the building's history, finding nothing more sinister than a bankruptcy in the 80s and a minor fire in 2003. No deaths, no tragedies, nothing to explain what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of all Monday mornings, and I stood at the building's entrance, watching the crowd of early arrivals push through the revolving doors. I could join them, squeeze into the main elevators, become just another anonymous suit in the morning crush. Instead, I walked to the service entrance. The freight elevator was already waiting, doors open like a mouth. The morning sun streaming through the loading dock cast my shadow long and dark across the threshold. I stepped inside and pressed 42. This time, I was ready. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at any reflective surface. The elevator rose smoothly, the only sound the mechanical hum of the cables and my own controlled breathing. Floor by floor, nothing happened. Until 13. The stop was gentler this time, almost polite. The air pressure shifted again, but now I noticed something else. A smell like ozone and old paper, the scent of forgotten offices and abandoned filing rooms. In my peripheral vision, the brushed steel walls seemed to ripple. I lasted 3 seconds before looking. The figure was closer in the reflection, close enough that I should have felt its presence behind me. Details emerged that I wished I couldn't see. The fabric of its suit wasn't fabric at all, but something that moved like skin, breathing in a rhythm that didn't match my own. Its fingers were too long, with too many joints, tapping against its thigh in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. But it was the face that made me close my eyes. Not because it was horrible, but because it was incomplete. Features that shifted every time I tried to focus on them, like someone had started to draw a person and kept erasing and redrawing, never quite satisfied with the result. The elevator continued upward, and I kept my eyes shut until the familiar ding announced floor 42. I practically ran to my cubicle, earning strange looks from the few early arrivals already at their desks. That's when I checked my phone and saw the timestamp on my last text message, sent while I was in the elevator, though I had no memory of typing it. Just 2 words. Occupied. Processing. The next few days blurred together. I started taking the stairs, all 42 flights, arriving at my desk drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. My supervisor made a comment about my dedication. My coworkers whispered about burnout. But even the stairwell wasn't safe. The emergency exit signs would flicker when I passed the 13th floor. The floor that didn't exist, that you couldn't access even if you wanted to. The door was welded shut, painted over so many times it looked like part of the wall. Yet sometimes, if I stood there long enough, I could hear something behind it. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of sliding sound. like someone dragging themselves across carpet. I started keeping a log, partly to track the incidents, and partly to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. The security footage became an obsession. I made friends with the overnight guard, brought him coffee and donuts in exchange for glimpses at the archived files. The timestamp was always the same. Whenever I was in the elevator, the system marked it as occupied, even when the footage showed me standing alone. But there were frames, single frames that you had to pause at exactly the right moment, where shadows fell in impossible directions, where the geometry of the elevator seemed to extend beyond its physical dimensions. The overnight guard stopped accepting my bribes after he saw one particular frame. He wouldn't tell me what he'd seen, just pushed the coffee back across the desk and suggested I find a new job. He transferred to a different building the next week. October bled into November, and the presence in the elevator grew bolder. Or maybe I was just becoming more attuned to it. I could feel it now, even when I wasn't in the building, a sensation like being watched through frosted glass. My reflection in bathroom mirrors would lag, just for a fraction of a second, as if it needed time to remember how to be me. The breaking point came on a Wednesday. I'd managed to avoid the service elevator for almost a week, but a partner needed files from the archive in the basement, physical files that couldn't be emailed or scanned. The main elevators were under maintenance. I had no choice. I pressed the button for the basement, trying to ignore how the elevator seemed to have been waiting for me, doors already open when I arrived. The descent was smooth, too smooth, like falling in a dream. When we passed the 13th floor, or rather the space between 14 and 12 where 13 should have been, the lights inside the elevator dimmed to almost nothing. In the near darkness, the reflection in the steel walls became clearer, as if shadows were its natural medium. The figure stood directly behind me now, close enough that I should have felt its breath on my neck. But there was no breath, no warmth, no presence at all except in that reversed world of polished metal. It leaned forward, and in the reflection, I watched its mouth move. No sound, but I could read the shape of the words. You see me. Not a question, a statement. The lights flared back to full brightness, and the elevator chimed for the basement. I grabbed the files and took the stairs back up, all 43 flights from basement to 42. My legs gave out somewhere around floor 30, and I sat on the concrete steps, shaking. That's when I noticed the emergency exit sign above me. Floor 13. But I'd been counting, and I'd started from the basement. This should have been floor 30. I looked down the stairwell, counted the flights below. 30. I looked up, counted to 42. 12 more flights. The math was impossible. The building had grown an extra floor, or I'd somehow stepped into a space that shouldn't exist. The door to floor 13 was different here, newer, with a window of frosted glass that showed only darkness beyond. As I watched, a shadow passed behind it. Not walking, sliding. I ran the rest of the way to 42 and submitted my resignation that afternoon. No notice, no explanation that would have made sense to anyone who hadn't been inside that elevator, who hadn't seen those yellow eyes that belonged to emergency exits and hazard warnings. My supervisor tried to convince me to stay. The partner whose files I'd retrieved made vague threats about references and future employment. But I was already packing my desk, shoving 3 months of accumulated office supplies into a cardboard box. I made one last mistake. I decided to take the service elevator down, some misguided sense of closure or maybe just exhaustion overriding my better judgment. The box was heavy, and 42 flights of stairs seemed impossible. The elevator was waiting, as always. I stepped inside, pressed L for lobby, and watched the doors close with the finality of a coffin lid. We descended in silence, the elevator and I, and whatever shared that space with us. At floor 13, there was no stop, no pause, just a moment where the lights flickered and the air grew thick. In the reflection, the figure stood so close I could see details I'd missed before. The suit wasn't black, but rather the absence of color, a void shaped like clothing. The skin underneath shifted between states, sometimes solid, sometimes dispersing like smoke. It raised one of those impossibly jointed fingers and pointed, not at me, but at my reflection. And for the first time, I noticed the difference. My reflection wasn't quite right. It moved when I moved, smiled when I smiled, but there was a delay so subtle I'd never noticed it before. Like it was receiving instructions from somewhere else, something else. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened onto a scene that shouldn't have existed. The lobby was full, packed with people despite it being well past business hours. But they were all wrong. They moved in patterns that repeated every few seconds, like a video loop. The security guard lifted his coffee cup, took a sip, set it down, lifted it again. A woman walked the same 7 steps toward the door, turned around, walked them again. And in every reflective surface, the polished floor, the glass doors, the brass fixtures, yellow eyes watched. I stepped out of the elevator, and the world snapped back to normal. The lobby was empty except for the night guard, who looked up from his crossword puzzle with mild surprise. The box in my arms felt heavier, as if it had absorbed some of the weight of whatever existed in that space between floors. I've been gone from that building for 3 weeks now. I found a new job, a small firm in a 2-story building with no elevators at all. But sometimes when I pass by office towers, I see them in the windows. Those yellow eyes, that impossible figure, watching from the reflected world that exists in every polished surface. Last night, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 2 words: still occupied. I've started taking sleeping pills to avoid dreams, but it doesn't always work. When it doesn't, I find myself back in that service elevator, descending past floor 13 again and again, each time seeing more details in the reflection. The figure isn't alone. There are others, pressed against the walls, existing only in that reversed space. They all have the same yellow eyes, the same impossible anatomy, the same patient watchfulness. And sometimes, in those dreams, when I look at my own reflection, my eyes are beginning to turn yellow too. The building's smart systems still recognize me. My keycard was deactivated, my biometric data supposedly purged, but the security logs show something different. Every night at 11:47 p.m., the exact time I first saw those yellow eyes, the service elevator moves on its own. It stops at floor 13, the floor that doesn't exist. The doors open onto nothing. The system logs show a single word: occupied. The overnight guards have started a pool on when the elevator will stop doing this. They think it's a glitch, a ghost in the machine, something that will resolve itself when it finally gets around to debugging the system. But I know better. I know that something lives in the space between 12 and 14, in the reflection of brushed steel and the timestamps of security cameras. Something that recognized me, that marked me, that waits with infinite patience for me to return. Because here's what I've learned. There are things that exist only when observed, and once you've seen them, you can never truly unsee them. They live in peripheral vision and reversed images, in the gaps between seconds and floors that shouldn't exist. They watch through yellow eyes that belong to no living thing, and they wait. The service elevator is still running, every night making its rounds, stopping at 13, still occupied, still waiting. And sometimes when I catch my reflection in the black screen of my phone or the window of a passing car, I swear I can see those yellow eyes looking back. And I wonder if I ever really left that elevator at all, or if some part of me is still there, trapped between floors in a building that insists someone shares the space with me, someone who only exists in the polished surfaces and the electronic dreams of smart buildings that know more than they should. The pills aren't working anymore. The yellow is spreading. Story 14. The wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, each swipe revealing nothing but white static beyond the windshield. My delivery truck groaned as I downshifted, the engine protesting against the grade of this forgotten Vermont back road. I'd taken this shortcut a dozen times before, but never in weather like this. The GPS had gone silent 20 minutes ago, its screen frozen on a map that no longer matched the reality outside. That's when I saw them. 2 headlights blinking beneath a twisted guardrail. pulsing like a distress signal in Morse code I couldn't decipher. I eased off the accelerator, squinting through the storm. The guardrail hung like a broken jaw, its metal teeth bent downward where something had punched through. Below it, barely visible through the swirling snow, a sedan rested at an impossible angle against the embankment. The headlights continued their rhythmic plea. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. My CB radio crackled to life before I could reach for it. The voice that came through was mine. Not similar to mine. Exactly mine. Down to the slight rasp I'd developed from too many cigarettes during long hauls. It spoke 4 words that made my blood crystallize. Don't go down there. I sat frozen, hand hovering over the radio. The voice couldn't be mine because I hadn't spoken, hadn't touched the transmitter. My mouth was dry as sand, lips sealed. The headlights below continued their desperate rhythm. The dashboard warning light flickered on, engine temperature dropping. A message scrolled across the display. Maintain engine operation. Risk of fuel, line freeze. Cabin heat failure imminent if engine stops. I'd never seen that warning before, not in 3 years of driving this truck. The rational part of my brain kicked in. Someone needed help down there. The voice on the radio, interference maybe, or my imagination playing tricks in the storm. I pulled onto what I hoped was the shoulder, keeping the engine running as instructed. The wind immediately attacked the truck's broadside, rocking it like a cradle in the hands of something massive and invisible. I grabbed my flashlight and emergency kit, then hesitated. Through the side mirror, I could see my own tracks in the snow, already being erased by the wind. But there were other tracks too, fresh ones, circling my truck. They appeared between one heartbeat and the next, as if something was moving around my vehicle right now, just beyond my ability to see it. The CB crackled again, my voice urgent now. Lock the doors. Stay inside. I was already outside. The cold hit like a physical assault, stealing my breath and replacing it with needles of ice. I pulled my collar up and started down the embankment, each step a small avalanche. The crashed sedan grew larger, more real, its red paint visible now through the snow. The headlights had stopped blinking. As I approached, I saw movement through the rear window. A hand, pale and trembling, pressed against the glass. The hand pulled away, leaving a perfect print in the condensation, then knocked 3 times. Deliberate. Controlled. I tried the driver's door. Locked. The passenger side. Same. I could see someone inside. A shadow slumped over the steering wheel. But when I shined my flashlight through the window, the shadow didn't match the angle of the body. It was as if I was seeing 2 different people occupying the same space. One visible, one suggested. The knocking came again, from the rear of the car this time. A muffled voice, gender indeterminate, filtered through the metal. The bag. In the trunk. Please. I need the bag. I circled the vehicle, my flashlight beam catching something that made me stop. Footprints. Fresh ones, maybe 5 minutes old, leading from the driver's door into the woods. But the door hadn't been opened. The snow piled against it was undisturbed. The tracks seemed to begin from nothing, as if someone had materialized beside the car and walked away. No, not walked. The spacing was wrong. The prints were too far apart, the stride too long. Whatever made them had been running. Another set of tracks caught my eye. These circled the car in a perfect spiral, getting closer with each revolution, ending at the trunk. They were identical to the first set. Same boot pattern, same size. But the snow in these was darker, as if something had melted and refrozen, leaving crystals that looked like tiny teeth. The voice from inside the car grew more insistent. I could make out words now, though they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The trunk, the woods, the wind itself. The bag has my medicine. Please, I can't stay like this much longer. I reached for the trunk release, and that's when I saw my reflection in the car's rear window, except I was standing too far to the left for the angle to work. The reflection showed me opening the trunk, reaching inside, pulling out a black duffel bag. But my hands were still at my sides, flashlight in one, the other clenched against the cold. The CB radio in my truck, 50 feet up the embankment, burst to life with my voice again. "Don't open it. For God's sake, don't open the trunk." The wind died. Completely. The silence that followed was worse than any howling. It was expectant, watchful. Snow fell in perfect vertical lines, each flake visible in my flashlight beam. I could hear my heartbeat, loud as thunder, and something else. Breathing that wasn't mine, coming from two different directions. One from inside the car, one from directly behind me. I didn't turn around. Some primitive instinct, older than thought, told me that turning around would make it real. Instead, I backed away from the car, each step careful, deliberate. The breathing behind me matched my pace perfectly, maintaining the exact same distance. My foot hit something soft. I looked down. A black duffel bag lay in the snow, its zipper partially open. Inside, I could see prescription bottles, dozens of them, their labels all bearing the same name. My name. The dates were wrong, though. They were dated 3 days from now. The breathing behind me stopped. I ran, scrambled up the embankment on all fours, snow burning my exposed skin, lungs screaming for air that seemed too thick to breathe. Behind me, I heard car doors opening, all of them at once, though I knew they'd been locked. The sound echoed wrong, as if happening in a space larger than the forest, larger than the storm. I reached my truck and yanked the door open, slamming it behind me and hitting the locks. The engine was still running, the heater blasting blessed warmth. But the windshield was fogged from the inside, and in the condensation, someone had drawn a simple message with their finger. "You brought it with you." The black duffel bag was on my passenger seat. I hadn't carried it. I'd left it down there, in the snow, 50 feet away. But here it was, zipped closed now, pulsing slightly as if something inside was breathing. The prescription bottles rattled with each pulse, a sound like dice being shaken in a cup. The CB radio crackled one more time, but the voice that came through wasn't mine. It was everyone's, a chorus of overlapping whispers that might have been male, female, young, old, all speaking in perfect unison. "The trunk is open now." I looked in my side mirror. The sedan below was gone. Not buried in snow, not hidden by the storm. Gone, as if it had never been there. The guardrail was intact, unbent. But the tracks remained, all of them, including a new set leading from where the car had been directly to my truck. They stopped at my door. Something knocked on the metal of my truck's undercarriage. Two distinct rhythms, one from the front axle, one from the rear. They were patient knocks, almost polite. The kind of knocking that said, "We have all night." The storm was predicted to last until dawn. 6 more hours. The bag on my passenger seat moved, just slightly, the zipper beginning to open from the inside. Through the gap, I could see an eye, human in shape but wrong in every other way. It was looking at me with recognition, with familiarity, as if it knew things about me that I didn't know about myself. I turned up the heat, gripped the steering wheel, and stared straight ahead into the white nothing of the storm. The knocking continued, sometimes on metal, sometimes on glass, always from 2 points exactly opposite each other, as if whatever was out there existed in 2 places at once, or as if there were 2 of them, or 2 of me. The radio had gone silent, but in that silence, I could hear something worse, my own voice, coming from outside the truck, having a conversation with itself. One voice was pleading to be let in, the other was explaining why that was impossible. I reached for the bag's zipper, then pulled my hand back. Reached again, pulled back. My reflection in the rearview mirror was doing the same thing, but our movements weren't synchronized. It was half a second ahead of me, showing me what I was about to do before I did it. The eye in the bag blinked. Dawn couldn't come fast enough, but I was beginning to suspect that dawn, like everything else on this road, might not be what it seemed. The clock on my dashboard had been reading 2:17 a.m. for the past hour. Either time had stopped, or I had. The knocking grew more insistent, more complex. It was playing a rhythm now, almost like a song I should recognize but couldn't quite place. My fingers began tapping along on the steering wheel, matching the beat perfectly, though I wasn't consciously controlling them. In the condensation on the windshield, new words were appearing, written by no hand I could see. "You've been here before." I had. Not tonight, not in this storm. But the memory was there, just out of reach, like something glimpsed in peripheral vision that disappears when you turn to look. The bag shifted again, and through the growing gap in the zipper, I could see more eyes now. All of them mine. All of them watching me with different expressions. Fear, anger, resignation, and something else. Hunger. The fuel gauge hadn't moved. It had been at quarter tank when I stopped, and it was still there, despite the engine running for over an hour. The odometer was frozen too, the numbers refusing to advance. I was idling in place in more ways than one, trapped in a bubble of now that wouldn't let me move forward or back. Outside, the two voices that were mine had stopped talking. The knocking had ceased. The silence was complete except for the engine's rumble and the whisper of snow against glass. But this wasn't a peaceful silence. This was the silence of held breath, of preparation. The bag opened fully. Inside were the prescription bottles, yes, but also photographs. Dozens of them, all showing me at different ages, in places I'd never been, with people I'd never met. In some, I was the delivery driver I am now. In others, I wore different uniforms: paramedic, police officer, park ranger. In one, I was standing next to the crashed sedan, smiling, holding the black duffel bag like a trophy. In the last photo, I was sitting in my truck, looking at photographs, while something with too many joints and my exact face peered through the back window. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because I knew with absolute certainty that if I did, I would see myself looking in, and then I would have to decide which one of us was real. The clock clicked over to 2:18 a.m. The storm continued until dawn, or what I chose to believe was dawn. The sky lightened gradually, revealing an empty road, no guardrail, no embankment, no tracks but my own. The bag was gone. The photos were gone. Those were. The only evidence anything had happened was the message still visible in the fogging windshield, and the fact that my CB radio would only receive one station now, a frequency that played nothing but the sound of knocking, forever, from 2 points exactly opposite each other. I drove away as the sun crested the mountains, but I could still hear it in the engine's rhythm, in the tire's rotation, in my own heartbeat. 2 knocks, patient and eternal, waiting for an answer I was terrified to give. The next delivery order that came through my dispatcher was for a black duffel bag, to be picked up from a sedan on a Vermont back road, and delivered to an address that, when I looked it up, turned out to be the coordinates of my own truck, at exactly the moment I'd stopped to help. I'm still driving. The knocking hasn't stopped. Sometimes I wonder if I ever left that spot on the road, if I'm still there now, engine running against the cold, watching snow erase all evidence of what's real. The fuel gauge still reads quarter tank. The clock still hesitates at 2:17, and sometimes in the corner of my eye, I see myself driving parallel to my truck on roads that don't exist, matching my speed perfectly, waiting for the moment when I'll finally look over and wave. Story 15. The grandfather clock in the mortuary's front parlor stopped keeping time 3 weeks before I noticed the footsteps. I remember this detail because I'd written it in the maintenance log. Antique clock needs servicing. But somehow the entry had vanished from the book, leaving only a faint indentation on the page beneath, like a memory pressed into paper, but never inked. I worked the night shift at Whitmore & Sons Funeral Home, a Victorian monstrosity squatting between Laurel Grove Cemetery and the abandoned Presbyterian Church on Elm Street. The building breathes with a century and a half of grief soaked into its bones. Mahogany panels that creak in patterns I've memorized, Persian rugs that muffle everything except what shouldn't be there, and that peculiar smell of formaldehyde mixed with old roses that clings to your clothes no matter how many times you wash them. My job is simple: maintain security, accept late-night deliveries from the coroner, Ensure the viewing rooms stay at precisely 68 degrees. I've done this for 7 years without incident, until last month when the house began rehearsing. It always starts at 3:07 a.m. The first time I heard them, those measured, deliberate footsteps, I was cataloging supplies in the basement storage room. The sound traveled through the ceiling above me. Heel-toe, heel-toe, the confident gait of someone who knows exactly where they're going. Starting in the chapel where we keep the casket displays, moving through the main viewing room, down the narrow hallway that smells perpetually of lilies despite there being no flowers, and ending at the side door that opens onto the cemetery. I rushed upstairs, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but found only the chapel's heavy curtains swaying slightly, as if someone had just brushed past them. The security system showed the side door alert, door ajar, for exactly 1 second before returning to secured. The cameras captured nothing but that subtle movement of fabric, like the building itself was exhaling. After that night, I started keeping a detailed log. Not in the official book, I'd learned that lesson, but in a small notebook I kept hidden in my jacket pocket. The footsteps came every night at 3:07, sometimes accompanied by other sounds, the whisper of fabric against wood, a soft clearing of a throat, the creak of someone settling into the front pew. By the second week, objects began moving, not dramatically. This wasn't some hackneyed poltergeist throwing things around. It was subtle, methodical. The ivory candles I'd arrange on the mantel would be found the next morning in a semicircle on the floor, their wicks blackened though never lit. The mourning veils we kept in storage would appear draped over the mirrors, following an old tradition we'd stopped practicing decades ago. The guest book would be open to a page that should have been blank, but showed the indentations of signatures that had never been written. I tried to rationalize it. The building was old. It settled at night. Perhaps the heating system created drafts that moved the curtains. Maybe I was sleepwalking, though I'd never done so before, and moving things myself. I installed a motion-activated camera in the chapel using my own money, aimed directly at the path the footsteps always took. What I captured made me stop eating for 2 days. The footage showed the empty chapel at 3:06 a.m. At 3:07, the air itself seemed to thicken, taking on the consistency of old glass, warping the image slightly. Then, nothing visible, but the carpet compressed in perfect footprint patterns, moving steadily across the room. The curtains parted for no one. The door's handle turned for empty air. I should have quit then, found another job, moved away from this town with its crooked headstones and streets that dead-ended at cemetery walls. But something held me there, the same obsessive need that makes people reread the same disturbing passage over and over, looking for meaning and horror. The next phase began when I found the photograph. I was cleaning out the old office in the building's 3rd floor, a room that had been locked for so long the key had rusted in the lock. Inside, among yellowed invoices and mouse-eaten ledgers, I discovered a tintype photograph tucked inside a Bible. It showed the main viewing room set up for a service, an open casket, though the exposure was too dark to see inside, mourners in Victorian dress, and a figure standing at the podium. But there was something wrong with the image. The longer I stared, the more I realized the mourners weren't quite facing the casket. They were all turned slightly, looking at something just outside the frame, their faces wearing expressions I couldn't quite parse. Not grief, but something closer to recognition. I brought the photograph to the Historical Society, but the elderly volunteer who managed their archives took one look at it and handed it back. She said something that lodged in my mind like a splinter. Some services never end. They just wait for the right time to resume. That night, I waited in the chapel. I turned off all the lights, disabled the cameras, and sat in the back pew with my notebook and a penlight. At 3:06, I clicked off the penlight and waited in absolute darkness. 3:07 arrived with the smell of old flowers. Not roses this time, but carnations, sweet and cloying. The footsteps began their procession, but now I could hear more. The rustle of multiple garments, the soft murmur of voices speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension, the creak of pew wood accepting invisible weight. The air grew cold, but not the clean cold of winter. This was the cold of spaces that haven't felt sunlight in decades, of root cellars and sealed tombs. My breath came out in clouds I couldn't see, only feel against my face. The darkness wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied, filled with presences that moved around me with purposeful intent. Then someone sat down next to me. I felt the pew shift slightly, heard the subtle adjustment of clothing, sensed the displacement of air that comes with another body occupying space. My hand trembled as I reached for the penlight, but before I could click it on, something that might have been a hand, cold, dry, smelling of formaldehyde and old paper, rested on my wrist. A voice, or maybe just the suggestion of a voice, spoke directly into my left ear. "You're sitting in my seat." I lurched out of the pew, scrambled for the light switch, flooded the chapel with harsh fluorescent brightness. Empty. Everything was empty. But on the pew where I'd been sitting, there was now a depression in the cushion, shaped like someone else had been there for hours. My notebook, which I'd been clutching, was gone. I found it the next morning in the basement, every page filled with the same name written over and over in handwriting that wasn't mine. Theodore Whitmore. Theodore Whitmore. Theodore Whitmore. I researched that name, found nothing in the funeral home's records, nothing in the town archives, nothing in the cemetery registry. But when I mentioned it to the volunteer at the Historical Society, she went pale and excused herself. She returned with a locked box from their restricted collection, and with shaking hands showed me a single document, a receipt for a funeral service dated 1889, for Theodore Whitmore. The peculiar thing was that every other line had been redacted with thick black ink, except for one notation at the bottom: service incomplete, body unrecovered. The footsteps continued their nightly journey, but now they were accompanied by more elaborate manifestations. I would arrive for my shift to find the viewing room arranged for a service, chairs in perfect rows, flowers that shouldn't exist anymore, varieties extinct for decades, arranged around an empty space where a casket should be, programs printed on paper that crumbled at my touch but reformed when I looked away. The security system began recording anomalies I couldn't explain. Doors would show as simultaneously open and closed. Motion sensors would trigger in impossible patterns, multiple locations at once, or in sequences that suggested something moving through walls. The temperature logs showed the building cycling through seasons in the span of minutes, summer heat to winter cold to autumn chill, over and over, as if time itself was stuttering. I tried leaving tape recorders running through the night, but they only captured a strange static that, when played back at different speeds, almost sounded like hymns being sung backwards, or maybe forwards in a language that predated words. Last week I made a mistake. I decided to follow the footsteps. At 3:07, when they began their journey from the chapel, I walked behind them, matching their pace exactly, through the viewing room, where invisible mourners seemed to part for our passage, down the hallway, where portraits of former directors watched with eyes that seemed to track something just behind me, to the side door, which opened onto the cemetery. The door swung wide without anyone touching it, and I followed the footsteps outside. The cemetery at night is different from the cemetery during the day. The headstones aren't where they should be, or maybe there are more of them, or maybe they're the same stones but from different decades, all existing simultaneously. The footsteps led me deeper, past graves I knew, and graves that couldn't exist yet, and graves that had been moved years ago. We stopped. I stopped, at a patch of ground that looked recently disturbed. The footsteps circled it 3 times, and I found myself doing the same, my legs moving without my conscious control. The earth here was soft, too soft, as if it had just been filled in. But the groundskeeper hadn't reported any new burials. I knelt down, pressed my hand to the soil, and felt it pressing back, not solid, but yielding in a way that suggested space beneath, hollow spaces that shouldn't exist. The smell of carnations grew stronger, mixed now with something else. The scent of a room that's been closed too long, of air that's been breathed too many times. That's when I realized the footsteps had stopped. Not ended, stopped. They were waiting. I ran. Stumbled through headstones that seemed to rearrange themselves to block my path. past mausoleums that hadn't been there before, over ground that sometimes felt like grass and sometimes felt like carpet. When I finally reached the funeral home's side door, it was locked. The key in my pocket didn't fit. The lock was older, rustier, as if decades had passed in the minutes I'd been gone. I had to break a window to get inside, and when I checked the clock, it was still 3:07. It had been 3:07 for what felt like an hour. The next morning, the director found me asleep at my desk, fully dressed but covered in soil. My shoes were clean, but my socks were caked with dirt, as if I'd walked through the cemetery barefoot, but someone had put my shoes back on afterward. He didn't fire me, just looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, in that tintype photograph, on the faces of mourners looking at something outside the frame. Now I understand what the volunteer at the Historical Society meant. The service never ended because it never properly began. Theodore Whitmore's funeral has been waiting for over a century to complete itself, and the house remembers. Every night at 3:07, it rehearses, preparing for a body that was never recovered, for mourners who no longer exist, for a closure that can't come. But here's what terrifies me most. I've started remembering things that haven't happened yet. I know that tomorrow night I'll find fresh flowers on my desk, carnations, white ones, tied with a black ribbon. I know that next week the basement walls will start showing water stains that form letters I won't be able to read. I know that in a month I'll open the supply closet and find a suit that fits me perfectly, laid out with a note in my own handwriting that says, "For the completion." The footsteps aren't searching for Theodore Whitmore anymore. They've found him. I think they've found him in me. I check my reflection now and sometimes see someone else looking back. Someone older, wearing clothes from a different century, with eyes that have seen a funeral that hasn't happened yet, but already occurred over 100 years ago. My hands shake when I write, but the tremor stops when I pick up the old fountain pen I found in the desk, the one that wasn't there before but has always been there. The director asked me yesterday if I'd be willing to work overtime next month. There's a special service scheduled, he said, though he couldn't remember booking it. When I asked who it was for, he looked confused and checked his ledger. The page was blank except for a time, 3:07 a.m. I said yes. I don't remember saying yes, but I must have, because I've already signed the overtime form. The signature looks like mine, but older, more formal, the way people wrote in the 19th century. Tonight, when the footsteps begin their journey, I won't follow them. I'll be waiting at the side door because I'm starting to remember why Theodore could never complete the service. It wasn't that the body was missing. It was that the body never stopped walking, never stopped trying to attend its own funeral, never stopped existing in that liminal space between dead and gone. The grandfather clock started working again yesterday, but it only shows one time, no matter where the hands should be. 3:07. I think soon I won't need to follow the footsteps anymore. I think soon the footsteps will be mine.